Beatrice Ellison pressed the forged letter into Ruth's hand the same morning she canceled the girl's name from the household accounts. "You leave at dawn," she said, "and don't come back." Ruth had read the letter. Every poisoned word her stepmother had written in her dead father's name, calling her unstable, desperate, a woman who would offer herself to any man willing to take her. Beatrice had signed it with a dead man's seal and sent her daughter to be destroyed by a stranger. She arrived at Blackthorn Hall with 73 cents, a forged letter, and a stepmother's cruelty at her back. The scarred man read it and pulled her a chair. If this story hits close to home, subscribe to our channel, drop your city in the comments, and don't you leave before the ending. The letter was still warm from Beatrice's hand when Ruth Ellison pressed it into her glove and climbed into the hired coach. She had read it. She wasn't supposed to. Beatrice had sealed it with the wax stamp she kept locked in the parlor drawer, her late husband's stamp. The one she used when she needed the dead man's authority, without the inconvenience of his conscience. But the wax had cracked in the August heat, and Ruth had peeled the edge back with the tip of her fingernail and read every word standing beside the hall table. Her traveling bag already in her hand, she'd pressed the seal back down. She'd climbed into the coach. She hadn't said a word. That was the kind of woman 8 years in Beatrice Ellison's household had made her. The coach was not a comfortable one. Beatrice had spent as little as possible on the hiring, which meant the springs were gone and the window glass was filmed with old dust. Ruth sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap the way her father's first wife must have sat composed. Quiet, invisible, and she watched the Hudson Valley roll past outside and thought about what the letter said. Miss Ruth Ellison has formed an attachment that has become a source of considerable embarrassment to this family. She speaks of Mr. Jonathan Mercer constantly. She has taken to writing his name in the household accounts. She has, on more than one occasion, suggested to her stepsisters that she intends to make herself known to him by any means available, including presenting herself at his estate without invitation. "I write to warn you, Mr. Mercer, so that you may send her away with the firmness this situation requires. She is a sensitive creature and will require plain language. I apologize for any inconvenience her behavior causes you." Ruth closed her eyes. She had never written Jonathan Mercer's name anywhere. She had never spoken it aloud to Lydia or Frances. She had, in fact, known nothing about the man beyond what every family in the Albany Valley knew: that he was a war veteran, that he was scarred, that he kept to his estate on the river and wanted no visitors, and that he was rumored to have thrown a county assessor off his property with enough force that the man's hat landed in the mill pond. She had never thought about Jonathan Mercer at all. But Beatrice needed her gone. Specifically, Beatrice needed her gone before the end of August, when the circuit court would hold its first session with a new magistrate. And before that magistrate could be asked uncomfortable questions about a promissory note that had once belonged to Ruth's father and had somehow ended up signed over to a freight agent named Daniel Pike. Ruth understood that now. She hadn't understood it before she read the letter. She understood it the way you understand a thing, when the understanding arrives too late to change anything, the way water understands the bottom of the well. The coach hit a rut. Ruth's shoulder struck the wall. She straightened her hat and looked back out the window. Blackthorn Hall appeared above the tree line about a quarter mile before the drive turned. It was a Federal-style manor, older than most of the valley's great houses, built when the river still carried Dutch trading sloops, and the families who owned both banks of it considered themselves a kind of American aristocracy. The stone was dark with age and river weather. The east wing had a new section of roofing that didn't match the original slate. The kitchen gardens looked recently worked. It was not what Ruth had expected. She'd expected ruin. That was what the gossip said, that Jonathan Mercer had let the place fall to nothing, that he lived alone in 3 rooms and drank himself through the winters. But the gardens were real, and the mill wheel at the creek was turning, and she could see a man moving along the fence line of the near pasture. checking posts with the unhurried efficiency of someone who owned the land and meant to keep it. The coach stopped. The driver did not speak to her. He opened the door, set the step, and retreated to the horses with the practiced discretion of a man paid to deliver a package and ask no questions. Ruth took her own bag. She walked to the front entrance. She knocked. An older man opened the door, gray-haired, straight-backed, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time making himself very difficult to read. He looked at her traveling bag. He looked at the letter in her hand. Something moved in his expression, quickly suppressed. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Yes." Ruth said, "I have a letter for Mr. Mercer. He's expecting it," the man said. "I'm Amos Reed, his steward. Come inside." The hall smelled like beeswax and old stone and something faintly medicinal she couldn't identify. Ruth followed Amos Reed through a corridor lined with framed survey maps, the kind her father used to hang in his study. Property lines drawn in careful India ink, acreage figures noted in a neat hand along the borders. She looked at them as she walked. Old habit. Her father had taught her to read a land map the way other men's daughters learned to read music. The study door was open. Jonathan Mercer was standing at the window with his back to the door. He was taller than she'd imagined, though she corrected herself. She hadn't imagined him. She'd simply formed an impression from gossip and county talk, which was not the same thing. He was dressed plainly. No coat, his shirt sleeves rolled back. The right side of his jaw and neck carried a burn scar she could see even from the doorway. Old and settled, the kind that had finished its healing years ago and simply remained as a fact about him. He turned when Amos knocked. His eyes found her immediately. They were gray and direct, and they spent about 2 seconds on her face before they moved to the letter. "Miss Ellison," he said. His voice was flat and unhurried. "I was told to expect a letter." "I imagine you were told to expect rather more than that," Ruth said. She hadn't planned to say it. She hadn't planned anything. Because the entire journey had felt like being carried towards something she couldn't stop. And planning inside an unstoppable current had seemed like a waste of the mental energy she might need later. But she'd said it, and she didn't take it back. Mercer looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't read. Then he crossed the room, took the letter from her hand, broke the resealed wax without comment, and read. Ruth stood. She did not fidget. She had learned how to stand in rooms where people discussed her as though she wasn't present. And she applied that skill now, keeping her breathing even and her hands still at her sides. The clock on the mantel said 3:47. Mercer read the letter a second time. Then he set it on his desk, looked at the window, and said, "How much of this is true?" "None of it," Ruth said. "You've never thought about marrying me. I didn't know your Christian name until the driver told me this morning." He looked at her with that unreadable expression again. Outside, the mill wheel turned. Somewhere in the house a door closed. "Your stepmother arranged this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, and you read the letter." Ruth held his gaze. The seal cracked. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. "Sit down, Miss Ellison," he said. "I've had a long enough week that I refuse to complete another person's cruelty before I've had supper." Ruth sat. The chair was heavy and close to the hearth, which was unlit because it was August. But the still held the morning's warmth, and she hadn't realized until that moment how much of her energy had been spent on the coach ride, holding herself straight against the jolting and the fear and the knowledge of what waited at the end of it. She let herself breathe. Mercer pulled his own chair around from behind the desk and sat facing her with the letter on his knee. He was studying her the way he might study a ledger, not unkindly, but carefully, looking for the item that didn't balance. "Tell me why she sent you," he said. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "She needed me removed from Albany for the county court session next month." "Why?" "Because I know how my father's accounts were kept. He taught me his bookkeeping methods for 15 years. After he died, I kept the household books for my stepmother. I found entries that didn't reconcile. I asked about them. 3 weeks later, she told me she'd arranged for me to deliver this letter, personally. Because the coachman had business on the river road, and it was convenient. Mercer's expression did not change. But something sharpened in his eyes. What kind of entries? A promissory note my father wrote in 1814. Intended to protect a portion of his estate as a trust for my benefit. It appears in his original will. It does not appear in the household accounts as a trust. It appears as a loan. Ruth paused. It was signed over to a freight agent. A man named Daniel Pike. Mercer went very still. The clock measured the silence in small, even strokes. Daniel Pike, he said, was my property agent for 6 years. I dismissed him in March. Ruth looked at him. Suspected theft. I couldn't prove it. He stood abruptly, walked to the desk, and opened the bottom drawer. He removed a ledger large, cloth-bound, the cover worn through at the corners, and carried it back to the chair. He held it out to her. Can you look at this? It wasn't a question. Ruth took the ledger. She opened it to the first page, scanned the column headers, and turned to the middle section. She read for perhaps 4 minutes. Mercer sat across from her and watched without speaking. This entry, Ruth said, setting her finger on a line halfway down page 43. Grain spoiled in transit, July 1816, 1200 weight. Charged to estate loss account. Yes. The freight receipt dated 3 days later from your river landing shows 1200 weight of flour shipped to Albany. The handwriting on both documents is the same. Mercer leaned forward. You can see that. My father taught me to read freight ledgers before I could read a novel, Ruth said. The spoiled grain wasn't spoiled, it was sold. Then Pike charged the estate for replacing it, and didn't replace it. She turned 2 more pages. Here again. Timber described as beetle damaged, sold off at a loss to a buyer in Kingston. But this receipt, she stopped. At the bottom of page 47. In a margin where no entry should have been, there was a handwritten notation. A date, 2 sets of initials, and beside them a figure she recognized not from Mercer's accounts, but from her own father's ledger. From the column she had memorized the morning she discovered the discrepancy. She recognized it because it was the amount of her trust. Her hands did not tremble. She had learned very young not to let her hands tremble. Mr. Mercer, she said, this margin notation. Do you know whose initials these are? He looked. DP is Pike. The second set, Ruth said, are the initials of my stepmother's brother. He and Mr. Pike attended the same church in Albany for 11 years. My father mentioned him in his correspondence once. As a man he did not entirely trust. The room was very quiet. She didn't send you here only to humiliate you, Mercer said. No, Ruth said. She sent me here because someone needed me somewhere. I couldn't ask questions about those accounts. And someone needed the scandal of my visit to damage my credibility so thoroughly that if I ever did find the records and bring them to a magistrate, I'd be dismissed as a desperate spinster who spent a month in a recluse's house for reasons no respectable woman would admit. Mercer stood and walked to the window. Outside, the pasture light was going gold with late afternoon. Ruth waited. She planned it very carefully, he said. Yes, she's always been careful with plans. He turned. How long has she been using you as household help? Since my father died. 8 years, without wages. Without wages, he looked at her steadily. I have 30 years of estate accounts in this study, and a dismissed agent, whose work I can't fully decipher because I'm a soldier, not a bookkeeper. I have fraudulent entries I can see clearly enough to know something is wrong and not clearly enough to know how wrong. Ruth met his gaze. I'm offering you paid work, he said. 30 days. Private room, meals provided, Amos Reed as your witness that this arrangement is professional and contracted. You'll have access to all financial records, the mill, the farm accounts, and the freight logs. Whatever you find is admissible in a county court, because you'll be working as a hired professional, not as a guest. Ruth looked at the ledger in her hands. She looked at the margin notation with its 2 sets of initials and its familiar figure. "I want the terms in writing," she said. Mercer walked to his desk, sat and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. "Tell me what you want in the contract." Amos Reed witnessed the document. He read it first, which Ruth had not expected, and then he looked at her over the top of the page with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite respect, but was somewhere in the territory of both. "Daily wage, 6 days a week." "Yes," Ruth said. "And you want a clause saying you may leave at any time with all wages already earned?" "Yes." "Smart," Amos said. He signed, he blotted. He handed the pen back to Mercer without comment. Ruth signed her name last, Ruth A. Ellison, in the clear. Accountant's hand her father had spent years training out of its childish slope. Mercer had the housekeeper, a stout and watchful woman named Mrs. Hale, show Ruth to a room on the 2nd floor, with a window overlooking the kitchen garden and a writing table beside it. The room was clean and plainly furnished, and had not been aired recently, which Mrs. Hale remedied by throwing the window open and beating the pillow with a force that suggested she'd been waiting for a reason. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Hale said. Mr. Mercer takes it in the dining room when there are guests. In the study when there aren't." She gave Ruth a look that was simultaneously assessing and withholding judgment. "You look like you haven't eaten since morning." "Since yesterday evening," Ruth said honestly. Mrs. Hale's expression shifted into something that was not warmth but was related to it. She left without another word and came back in 20 minutes with bread, cold chicken, and a cup of strong tea, which she set on the writing table and departed without ceremony. Ruth ate standing at the window. She looked out at the kitchen garden, the bean rows, the squash coming in along the fence line, the herb beds that someone maintained with real attention, and she thought about the ledger, about the margin notation, about the numbers she recognized. She thought about her father, who had kept his own accounts with the careful precision of a man who knew that numbers were the truest language available to him, because numbers did not flatter and did not deceive and did not say one thing in company and another behind closed doors. He had taught her the same language. You will always be able to find your own way. He had told her once when she was 12, and had just caught an error in his surveying partner's calculation. As long as you can read what the numbers say, no one can tell you the world is different than it is. She hadn't known then what he was preparing her for. She finished the tea and opened her traveling bag. That evening at supper, Mercer sat at the head of the table, and Ruth sat to his right, which was not where a female employee would normally be placed, and which she suspected reflected less social convention than simple practicality. He'd left the chair nearest the window, which had the best light for reading. He ate without speaking for the first 10 minutes. Ruth did not attempt to fill the silence. She had spent 8 years in a house where silence meant she had done something wrong. But she was beginning to understand that Mercer's silence was a different animal. It was not hostile. It was simply the silence of a man who saw no reason to speak unless he had something to say. "I pulled the freight logs for 1,814 through 1,816, he said, passing the bread without being asked. "The ones Pike kept. There are gaps." "How long are the gaps?" 3 months in 1,815. 2 in early 1,816. Ruth set down her fork. "Those would correspond to the periods when the grain and timber entries I found were recorded. If the gaps are where the fraudulent receipts should be, then he removed the pages that would have contradicted his own records." Mercer nodded. "That's what I assumed. I couldn't prove it. I can if I can find where the originals were stored." He looked at her. "There's a records room off the river storehouse. Pike used it for the freight correspondence. I locked it after I dismissed him, but I haven't opened it since. I'd like to start there tomorrow morning. Amos will go with you." Ruth picked up her fork again. "Mr. Mercer." "Yes. When the coachman brought me here today, was he supposed to watch for your reaction?" A pause. "Your stepmother asked me by letter last week to inform her of anything I observed when the delivery was made." She used the word delivery. The word landed in Ruth's chest like a stone in still water. She kept her expression even. She wanted confirmation, Ruth said. That you'd turned me away, yes. He reached for the water pitcher, filled his glass and set it down. I did not write back. She'll send someone to find out. Let her. His voice was flat and entirely without heat, which somehow made it more certain than anger would have. She planned something on my property using my name. She'll find that was a significant miscalculation. Ruth looked at him across the candlelight, the scarred jaw, the steady gray eyes, the sleeves still rolled back as though he'd been working all day and hadn't bothered with formality for supper. You're angry, she said. I'm precise, he said. There's a difference. She considered that. My father used to say the same thing. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Just a fraction. He sounds like a man who kept careful records, Mercer said. He did, Ruth said, right up until the day he couldn't. The candle between them flickered in a draft from the hall. Neither of them moved to shield it. She was in the records room before 7 the next morning. Amos Reed unlocked it without comment, lit 2 lamps, set them where they'd do the most good, and retreated to the doorway with the particular skill of a man who knew when to be present and when to be invisible. The records room was not large. 3 walls of shelving, a central table, and a year of dust on every horizontal surface. Ruth found the freight logs, immediately 12 volumes, canvas-bound, spine labeled by year, and she pulled 1,814 through 1,816 and set them on the table and opened the first. She worked in silence for 2 hours. Pike had been careful. But careful in the way of a man who didn't expect to be read by someone who knew what to look for. He'd altered entries in a consistent pattern, the year-end totals manipulated just enough to absorb the missing funds without triggering an obvious discrepancy. He'd used 2 slightly different inks, but the difference was subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were looking at the forest instead of the trees. Ruth was looking at the trees. By 9 o'clock, she had 3 pages of her own notes. By 10, she had found the first falsified tenant charge. A family named Garrett, farm on the North Slope, charged an overage on their autumn rent in 1,815 to cover a grain shortage that had never actually existed. She went and found Mercer in the stable. The Garrett family, she said. North Farm. They were charged $1.80 in excess rent in October 1,815. The charge was fraudulent. It offset the grain sale. Mercer looked up from the harness he was checking. The Garretts have been on this land since my father's time. Then they're owed $1.80. And I expect there are others. He stood. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, measuring look she was beginning to recognize. How many, he said. I haven't finished the full audit, but the pattern repeats. I'd estimate 4 or 5 families, possibly more. Over 2 years, he set the harness down. I'll write out to Amos. We'll pull the tenant payment books. I already asked him to find them, Ruth said. Mercer stopped, looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost smile that was not quite there yet. Like the sun thinking about coming through clouds. Yes, he said, I suppose you did. The next 3 days moved in a rhythm Ruth had not experienced in 8 years. Work, real work, the kind her mind had been built for. The records room in the mornings, the study in the afternoons. Supper at 6 with Mercer, who asked useful questions and did not pretend to know more than he did, and did not interrupt her mid-thought. He was not easy company. He was blunt to the point of occasional sharpness, and he had a temper that showed in brief flashes a hard word. A door closed too firmly, but it never aimed at her. She began to understand that his anger ran in a straight line at dishonesty and injustice, not at the convenient targets around him. On the 3rd morning, she found a second name she recognized, not the Garrett family. Not another tenant. A name in the freight correspondence column, written in Daniel Pike's hand beside a reference to a loan against property. Ellison Trust for B. Authorized B. Beatrice Ellison. Ruth set down her pen. She looked at the entry for a long time. The lamp beside her made her shadow stretch up the wall and over the shelves where years of records waited. Her father had built that trust for her. He'd written it into his will with the particular precision of a man who understood that after he was gone, she would need something that was unambiguously hers, something with a number on it, documented in a court-recognized instrument that no subsequent domestic arrangement could simply absorb. Beatrice had absorbed it anyway. She'd found Daniel Pike, or Daniel Pike had found her, and between them they had disguised the trust principle as a loan made from household funds, loaned it through Pike's freight business, and begun collecting interest on money that had never legally been Beatrice's to move. Ruth pulled the page, set it beside her notes, looked at the 2 sets of initials in Mercer's ledger margin from the first day, and at the freight correspondence in front of her, and at the figure that connected them both. She heard Mercer's boots in the hall. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her face. "What did you find?" he said. Ruth looked up at him. "I found where my inheritance went," she said. "And I found whose handwriting carried it there." He came into the room. She showed him the entry. He read it once, he read it again. When he looked up, his expression was controlled, but only barely. "Pike and her brother arranged it," he said, "and she directed it. Yes. This is dated 6 months after my father died. I was 20 years old." Ruth set the page down flat on the table. She was careful. The entry is worded as an authorized loan. "If it ever came to court, she'd claim my father sanctioned it, and that I was too young to understand the instrument. She'd have me characterized as confused, unstable." Ruth's voice stayed even. "It's why she needed me here, humiliated, in a situation I couldn't explain. She needed the story to run ahead of me." Mercer's jaw was tight. "I want to give this page to Amos for safekeeping," Ruth said. "And then I want to go through the rest of the freight correspondence before the end of the week. Because I believe there are more entries. I believe there is enough here to take before the magistrate." He nodded once. Then he said quietly, "She built a very elaborate trap around you, she did." Ruth gathered her notes with steady hands. "She made one error." Ruth looked at him. "She put me in a room full of ledgers and assumed I'd too frightened to read them. On the 4th evening, just as the light was going off the river and the kitchen garden threw long shadows across the courtyard, Amos Reed appeared in the study doorway with his hat in both hands and his expression carefully neutral. "Ryder just came in from the Albany Road," he said. "Charles Vale, Mrs. Ellison's cousin. He's at the gate. Says he's come to escort Miss Ellison back to her family." Ruth set down her pen. Mercer looked at her across the desk. "What would you like to do?" he said. She stood, smoothed her dress. "I'd like to speak to him myself," she said. Mercer stood as well. "I'll be on the porch." Charles Vale was a broad-faced man who wore his hat pushed back at an angle that suggested I had heard the gesture described as rakish and had decided it applied to him. He sat his horse at the gate with 2 men behind him and an expression of performed concern that Ruth recognized from years of watching Beatrice perform identical emotions in Albany parlors. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Your stepmother is beside herself." "I imagine she is," Ruth said. "What did she tell you, Mr. Vale?" "That you came here under a misunderstanding, and that the longer you remain, the more it damages your reputation. And that Mr. Mercer," as he stopped, he'd seen Mercer on the porch. "Mr. Vale." Mercer's voice came across the yard without particular volume, which made it more effective than shouting. "Finish your sentence." Vale cleared his throat. "I only meant to say that the situation is irregular." "It is," Mercer said. "Miss Ellison is employed here under a written contract witnessed by my steward. She came here under a false letter written in her father's name by your cousin. I'm aware of the distinction between those 2 facts. Even if you aren't." Vale shifted on his horse. He turned back to Ruth. "Miss Ellison, I entered this house under a lie." "Mr. Vale," Ruth said, "I remain here under a written contract. Please tell Mrs. Ellison that the difference between those 2 circumstances is my consent." and that I understand it very well. She'll say your veil stopped again. Recalibrated. She has concerns about your judgment. Then she should bring those concerns to a magistrate. Ruth's voice did not waver. Along with an explanation of the promissory note in my father's name that was signed over to a freight agent named Daniel Pike, whose handwriting I have been examining all week in the company of 2 witnesses. She held his gaze. Tell her I said hello. Vale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mercer on the porch. Then he looked at the 2 men behind him as if one of them might supply a useful response. None of them did. He turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Ruth stood at the gate and watched him go. She heard Mercer come off the porch and stop a few feet behind her, close enough that she could feel him there, without turning. He'll be back, she said. Probably, Mercer said. But not tonight, she turned. He was watching her with that careful, considering look, and there was something in it now that hadn't been there the first day, a weight, or a recognition. She couldn't have named it exactly. You didn't need me there, he said. No, Ruth said. But it was good of you to be on the porch. He almost smiled. Not quite. Come inside, he said. Amos found 3 more tenant payment books. She followed him back across the courtyard. Behind her, the gate stood open in the late summer heat, and the road wound back toward Albany and Beatrice's house, and everything Ruth Ellison had spent 8 years accepting as the permanent shape of her life. She didn't look back. The ledger notation she'd found on that first afternoon stayed in her mind like a splinter small, specific, impossible to ignore. On the 5th morning, she pulled the freight correspondence from 1813 as well, going back further than she'd originally planned, and found what she'd been afraid to look for. The note was small, a single line, tucked into a column of routine shipping entries for July 1813. It referenced a land survey filed in Ulster County by a Mr. Thomas Ellison and noted a property line adjustment agreed upon between Ellison and a partnering interest called R.B. Trading, Ruth's father. His name. She checked the date against her father's personal correspondence, which she had kept folded in her traveling bag since the day after he died, because she'd been afraid to leave them in Beatrice's house. The survey reference was real. The property line adjustment was real. But R.B. Trading did not appear anywhere in her father's papers. And the description of the adjusted boundary, as recorded in Pike's freight log, moved the southern edge of the Ellison land by 40 feet in a direction that happened to put a productive spring-fed lot entirely on the far side of the new line. On the far side of a line that now apparently belonged to R.B. Trading. She sat with the ledger open in the lamplight for a long time. This was older than the trust. This was before the war. Before her father's health failed, before Beatrice had any particular urgency to consolidate what she could control. This meant someone had been planning for a very long time. She wrote the date, the entry, and the boundary description in her notes. She wrote R.B. Trading in block letters and underlined it twice. She looked at it for a moment. Then she got up, walked out of the records room, crossed the courtyard, went up the back stairs, and knocked on Mercer's study door. He was at his desk. He looked up. I need to ask you something, Ruth said. Sit down, he said. She sat. She looked at him across the ledger in her hands. Outside, the summer morning moved along the river with perfect indifference to the particular quality of the silence in that room. Do you know, she said, who owns R.B. Trading? Mercer went very still. After a moment he said, where did you see that name? Your freight correspondence. 1813. It appears in connection with a land survey filed by my father in Ulster County. Mercer stood up slowly. He crossed to the shelf behind his desk, pulled a deed box from the second shelf, unlocked it with a key he kept on his watch chain, and withdrew a document that he set on the desk between them. Ruth looked at it. It was an incorporation record for R.B. Trading Company, filed in Albany County in 1812. The first named partner was Daniel Pike. The second was a man whose name she didn't immediately recognize. But the third was Beatrice Ellison's brother, whose initials she had seen in a ledger margin on the first afternoon she'd spent in this house. Ruth looked up at Mercer. "This has been running for 5 years," she said. "At least," he said. "Possibly longer. I found the incorporation record in Pike's papers after I dismissed him. I didn't know what it connected to." He looked at her. "I know now." The morning light through the study window lay quiet across the desk between them. The deed box sat open, the document lay flat. Ruth set her notebook beside it. Her father's name, her inheritance, a spring-fed lot in Ulster County that should have been hers. A network of false entries that had taken 5 years and 3 men and 1 determined stepmother to construct. And here, on a desk in a house she'd arrived at, with 73 cents in her glove and a forged letter in her hand, every piece of it beginning to surface. "We're going to need certified copies," she said. "Of everything. I'll send for the county recorder tomorrow." Ruth picked up her pen. "Then I have more to find before he arrives," she said, and turned back to the ledger. Mercer sat down across from her. He reached for the deed box. He began sorting documents. Neither of them spoke for a while. The study was quiet, and the river outside moved as it always had, carrying everything downstream. And neither of them needed words for what was happening in that room, the slow, methodical work of bringing a buried thing back into the light where it could be properly named. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The county recorder arrived on a Thursday, and Ruth had his certified copies ready before he finished his second cup of coffee. She'd been up since 4:30. Not because she couldn't sleep, she'd learned to sleep anywhere. During the years she spent managing Beatrice's household on 3 hours a night, but because the freight correspondence from 1813 had opened a thread she couldn't stop pulling. Every time she found one falsified entry, it led to another. Every corrected figure revealed a human consequence she hadn't expected. It was the consequences that kept her awake, not the numbers. The numbers were simply the language the theft had used. The consequences were real people who'd paid for someone else's fraud with their own harvests, their own rent money, their own children's winters. Amos Reed found her at the records table at 5 in the morning with 4 ledgers open and her notes covering every available inch of the working surface. He set a cup of coffee beside her without comment. Looked at the ledgers. Looked at her notes. "How many families?" he said. 7 confirmed, Ruth said. "Possibly 9. I'm still cross-referencing the 1,816 timber entries." Amos was quiet for a moment. Then he said the Harmon family, North Road. They lost their eldest boy to fever that winter. Mrs. Harmon always said they couldn't afford the doctor because the October rent took everything they had. Ruth set down her pen. She looked at the entry for the Harmon farm, $1.60. Fraudulent overage, October 1,816, charged against a timber shortage that Daniel Pike had manufactured and pocketed. $1.60. I'll have a complete accounting ready for Mr. Mercer by Friday, she said. Amos picked up his own coffee. He won't sleep either, once you show him. She looked at him. He takes it personally, Amos said. Always has. When his father ran this property, there were men who worked every angle they could find to squeeze the tenant farms. Jonathan spent his 20s fighting those men through county court. Then he went to war and came back and found Pike had been running the same game inside his own house. Amos set his cup down. It doesn't sit clean with him. Ruth thought about that. About a man who went to war for something he believed in and came home to find that the thing he'd trusted to protect had been quietly robbed while he wasn't looking. She understood that feeling better than she'd expected to. Tell me something, she said. Plattsburgh, yes, Amos said. And the knee. He doesn't talk about it. I know, Ruth said. He doesn't have to. She turned back to the ledger. Amos left. Outside, the Hudson moved in the dark, carrying itself toward the city with the indifferent patience of things that have been moving a very long time. Ruth wrote the Harmon entry into her accounting, added the notation. $1.60. Fraudulent overage, October 1816. Family charged for shortage that did not exist. Amount to be restored with interest. She underlined the last 4 words. The presentation to Mercer happened Friday morning in the study. Ruth had organized the findings into 3 categories: estate fraud, tenant overcharges, and trust misappropriation, and had prepared a single summary page that laid out the total figures without burying the essential facts in column detail. Mercer sat across from her and read the summary page without speaking. He read it twice. Then he turned to the detailed accounting and went through it page by page with the focused silence of a man who has learned to manage his reactions in public spaces and considers his own study a public space when someone else is present. Ruth watched his jaw. She'd learned in 4 days of meals and working evenings that his jaw was the most reliable indicator available. Not his eyes, he controlled those extremely well. Not his voice. It was tight now, getting tighter. He reached the Harmon entry. The boy's name was Samuel, Amos said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come back. He was 14. Mercer set the page down flat on the desk. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. "I want the Garrett family and the Harmon family contacted first," he said. "Today. Amos, write out yourself. Don't send a hand." "Already saddling," Amos said. And was gone. Mercer looked at Ruth. "The trust misappropriation. You're certain the figure is accurate?" "To the cent," Ruth said. "That money was your father's provision for you?" "Yes. And it's been running through Pike's freight accounts for 3 generating interest that Beatrice's household has been spending?" "Yes." He stood up from the desk and walked to the window. Ruth had noticed that he walked to the window when he needed to think, without anyone watching his face. She gave him the window. After a moment he said without turning, "She sent you here to destroy your credibility before you could find this?" "Yes." "Which means she knew you were capable of finding it." Ruth paused. That was a thing she hadn't said aloud yet, and hearing it from someone else's voice made it land differently. "She knew what my father taught me. She watched him teach me for 15 years. Ruth kept her voice even. "She was never afraid of me being unqualified. She was afraid of me being qualified." He turned from the window then. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't pity. She would have closed like a door against pity, and wasn't admiration in the simple, easy sense. It was something more complicated, something that looked like recognition. "She made a significant error," he said. "She made several," Ruth said. "But the largest one was assuming that humiliation would stop me, rather than clarify my thinking." Something happened in his expression then. Just briefly, like a door opening a single inch before someone caught it and held it. "Finish the 1,816 timber entries," he said. "I'll have the county recorder back on Monday." Ruth nodded. She gathered her papers. She was nearly at the door when he spoke again. "Miss Ellison." She stopped. "The work you've done this week." He paused, not hesitating, choosing. There was a difference. And she was learning to read it. It would have taken a trained attorney 6 months, and access I couldn't have given a stranger. "You came here with 73 cents and found the center of it in 5 days." Ruth held the doorframe. She thought about her father's voice, reading her ledger entries at 12 years old, and correcting her carrying without condescension. She thought about 8 years of keeping Beatrice's books, and never being paid, and never being thanked, and being carefully, methodically taught that her usefulness was invisible, because invisible things don't make demands. "My father believed numbers tell the truth when people won't," she said. "He taught me to trust the numbers." "He was right," Mercer said. She left the study and went back to the records room. And she did not examine too closely why those 4 words felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in 8 years. The week that followed settled into a rhythm that Ruth had not experienced since her father was alive. mornings in the records room, working through the remaining freight correspondence with the methodical focus she'd inherited from a man who believed that accuracy was a form of respect. Afternoons in the study with Mercer, where they cross-referenced her findings against his estate journals and Amos's tenant payment books. Evenings at the dining table, where the conversation had migrated from professional to something less easily categorized, still careful, still bounded, but no longer entirely transactional. He moved her desk to the window without being asked. She noticed that he favored the left staircase, not the right, and never climbed more than one flight if he could avoid it. She did not mention it. She simply stopped leaving materials on the upper floor that required his retrieval. He noticed that she worked until the lamp ran low and forgot meals when she was deep in a calculation. He began having Mrs. Hale leave a plate near the records room door around midday with the casualness of a man arranging furniture. Not performing a kindness. She ate it. She didn't thank him. They both understood that direct gratitude in this register would require the other person to deflect it. And neither of them had the patience for that particular social ritual. The easy tenderness of it was the most dangerous thing about that week. On Wednesday of the second week, Amos brought word that 3 tenant families had sent letters to the house. Not complaints receipts. Amos had written out personally to each family, as Mercer had asked, and had explained that an accounting error had been discovered and corrected, and that the excess rent charges would be returned with appropriate interest. The families had sent back written acknowledgments. Careful and formal, the way people write when they are not sure they're allowed to be grateful. Mercer read the letters at the dining table that evening. He read them quietly. Then he set them down and reached for his glass. And Ruth saw in the particular set of his shoulders the specific quality of that stillness, that he was doing the same thing she did when something hit the place she kept protected, holding it in. Holding it together, because you learned young that feeling things visibly was an invitation for someone to use those feelings against you. They shouldn't have needed to send letters, he said. No, Ruth agreed. But they did, which means they've been afraid not to account for every communication with this house. That's what Pike built, not just a fraud, a culture of fear. Mercer set his glass down carefully. How do you do that? She looked at him. Do what? See the thing underneath the thing. He was looking at the letters. I see the numbers. I see the fraud. You see what the fraud did to the way people think. Ruth considered that. My father used to say that every figure in a ledger represents a decision someone made. If you want to understand the figure, you have to understand the decision. And if you want to understand the decision, you have to understand the person who made it. She paused. The tenants sent letters because Pike trained them to document everything with this house, or be accused of owing more than they paid. That's not an accounting problem. That's what 8 years of being made to feel like a suspect does to a person's daily habits. She had not intended to end on that sentence. It arrived before she'd decided to let it. Mercer looked at her then with full attention. Not the focused professional attention she'd gotten during the ledger work. Something quieter. You know that particular habit, he said. Intimately, Ruth said. She picked up her fork. The pork is getting cold. He let her redirect it. That was another thing she was learning about him. He understood when a door was being held at a careful inch, and he didn't push it. She was grateful for that. More grateful than she was comfortable examining. The twist arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and it arrived in the shape of a 9-year-old ledger she hadn't opened yet. She'd been working through the oldest freight correspondence, the years before Pike's fraud was fully operational, looking for the earliest evidence of RB Trading's involvement. She'd expected to find it in 18,813, which was the year the incorporation record showed. She found it in 1,811, a single entry, brief and disguised in routine language, a reference to a surveying partnership agreement, a shared cost arrangement between Mercer Land Interests and an Ellison property survey in Ulster County. The entry described the sharing of surveying expenses between two neighboring landowners. But the surveying partnership agreement referenced in the entry had not been filed in Ulster County. Ruth knew because she had her father's complete correspondence for that year, and there was no such agreement in it. Her father had surveyed in Ulster County in 1811. He had done so alone, under his own commission, for a private buyer whose name she'd never known. She pulled the private buyer's reference from her father's papers. The buyer's agent was listed as a trading company. RB Trading. Her hands were very still on the page. RB Trading had been involved with her father's land work 2 years before its official incorporation, which meant the company existed before the record said it existed, which meant the incorporation filing was not the beginning. It was the formalization of something that had already been running. She stood up so fast her chair scraped backward. Mercer was in the study. She was there in under 2 minutes, the ledger and her father's letter in her hand. "Look at these," she said. She set both documents on his desk. She stood across from him while he read, and she watched his face, and she watched the exact moment he understood. It was there in the jaw. The specific tightening, RB. Trading was operating before 1812, he said. By at least a year, possibly 2. Ruth pressed her finger to the entry date. "My father surveyed land in Ulster County in 1811 at the commission of a buyer represented by R.B. Trading. He wouldn't have known the company name was significant. It was a standard commercial commission." She took a breath. "But it means they identified him years before they moved against his trust. They weren't opportunists. They built a relationship with him deliberately." Mercer was quiet for a long moment. "They needed access to his survey records," he said slowly. "Yes, because those records would show property boundaries, including any lots with particular value water access, timber, productive agricultural land, including the spring-fed lot in Ulster County," Ruth said, "which my father surveyed in 1811, and which appeared 2 years later on the wrong side of a boundary line adjustment that his records don't show he agreed to." The room was very still. "They used him to identify the valuable land," Mercer said. "And then they used his own survey work to justify the boundary adjustment that took it from him. While he was alive," Ruth said. "He never knew. He trusted the commercial commission as legitimate work. He had no reason to connect a routine survey to." She stopped, steadied herself. "He never knew they were building a case to take his property through his own documentation." Mercer stood. He crossed around the desk and stopped in front of her. And for a moment she thought he was going to say something careful and measured and appropriate, and she was not sure she could bear that right now. "He didn't." He said, "I am sorry. What they did to your father was calculated and deliberate. And he deserved better. Simple. No softening. No performance." Ruth looked at him. The lamp between them was steady. Outside, the river moved. "We need to find who the R stands for," she said. "In RB Trading. I know a man at the county recorder's office in Kingston who can pull the original filings." Mercer moved back to his desk. "I'll write tonight, and the B," Ruth said. "B could be Beatrice's brother. But it could also be Beatrice herself." He stopped writing. He looked up at her. "If Beatrice's own name is on that incorporation record," Ruth said, "then she wasn't a passive beneficiary of her brother's scheme. She was a founding partner. Everything she did after my father died wasn't opportunism." Ruth set the ledger down on his desk with a soft, precise sound. Mercer set down his pen. "Write your letter," Ruth said. "I'll go back to the records room." She was at the door when she heard him say, "Quietly, Miss Ellison. You don't have to carry this alone tonight." She stopped. She kept her hand on the doorframe and kept her back to him, because she knew with absolute certainty that if she turned around right now, with that particular sentence still in the air between them, she would lose the careful composure she'd been maintaining for 13 days. "I know," she said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." She went to her room. She sat at the writing table by the window and looked at her father's letter, the commission record, the buyer's agent notation, the company name that had been woven through her father's honest work, like rot in a timber beam. Invisible until the weight came down, she did not cry. She hadn't cried since the day she'd read Beatrice's forged letter in the hall and put it back in the envelope and climbed into the coach. But she allowed herself, alone in the dark, with the river moving below, to feel the full weight of what had been done to him. To them, the patient, methodical theft of a good man's work and his daughter's future, carried out over years by people he'd trusted because he was the kind of man who believed most people operated in good faith. He'd been wrong about that. She was going to make it right. The Kingston letter came back in 4 days, and the answer was worse than Ruth had prepared for. Or better, depending on how you measured things. The original R. B Trading Incorporation had 4 partners, not 3. Daniel Pike, a man named Rourke, who ran a land speculation firm in Albany, and Beatrice Ellison, née Rourke, listed under her maiden name. Filing dated 6 months before she married Ruth's father. Ruth read the letter at the records table, with Amos standing 3 feet away and the morning light coming through the window, and the Hudson moving outside with its absolute indifference to human scheming. She married him on purpose, Amos said. He wasn't asking. She married him because he was the best surveyor in the county and a legitimate landowner with excellent standing in every courthouse from Albany to Kingston, Ruth said. She married him because her brother's trading company needed someone inside the property records. Someone who could access survey documents and ownership histories without raising questions. She set the letter down. She married him because he was useful. And you? Ruth looked at the letter. I was the complication. I was the reason he created the trust. He must have sensed something, toward the end, even if he couldn't name it. She thought about her father's hands on the ledger pages, his patient explanations of carrying methods and column reconciliation, the particular quality of his attention when he watched her work. He made sure I had the tools to find it. Amos was quiet for a long moment. Does Mr. Mercer know yet? Not yet. Ruth picked up the letter. I'm going to tell him now. She found him in the stable, which had become her consistent morning search location since she'd realized he checked the horses before breakfast, regardless of what else the day required. He was talking quietly to a bay gelding, his hand on the animal's neck, and he didn't hear her come in until she was standing 2 stalls down. He turned, he saw her face. Show me, he said. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it standing in the stable, with the horses moving quietly around them and the August heat already building outside. He read it twice, then he folded it, held it, and was still. Rourke, he said, her maiden name. She was a founding partner before she became an Ellison. She built the entire scheme and then married into position to execute it. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Ruth. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Not formally, not as a correction, just directly. The way you say someone's name, when there isn't another word for what you need them to understand. She held his gaze. She spent years building a trap around your father, he said. And when he died, she spent 8 more years building a trap around you. And the moment you started to see it clearly, she shipped you here to be destroyed. He folded the letter again. I want you to know that every document we have goes to the magistrate the day you say. I will send for the county attorney myself. I will provide witnesses, certified copies, and my personal testimony if it's useful. Whatever you need. Ruth's throat was tight. She managed it. I need the boundary survey records from Ulster County, she said. And I need you to send for your attorney today. He'll be here tomorrow morning, Mercer said. She nodded. She turned to go, Miss Ellison. His voice stopped her again. And she almost smiled at the return of the formality, the careful, correct re-establishment of the working distance he'd just briefly abandoned. She turned. You said your father believed numbers tell the truth when people won't. Mercer said. He held the folded letter. He was right. And so was your father when he chose who to teach. Ruth looked at him across the stable. In the warm, dusty morning air, with the bay shifting quietly beside him and the Kingston letter in his hand and 13 days of careful, respectful, increasingly impossible professional distance between them. Go send for your attorney, she said. We have a great deal of work to do before Monday. The attorney, a compact and sharp-eyed man named William Cord, arrived the following morning and spent 6 hours in the study going through Ruth's organized documentation with the systematic attention of someone who has learned to treat every paper as a potential weapon. He asked Ruth questions, precise, testing questions designed to find the weak points in her accounting and expose any assumptions she'd made that weren't supported by the physical record. She answered everyone. She had anticipated most of them. For the 3 she hadn't, she located the supporting documents while he waited. By the afternoon, Cord set down his pen and looked at Mercer. She's built you a case, he said. Not a complaint. A case. The misappropriation of the trust is airtight. The dating discrepancy on the boundary adjustment alone would give a county magistrate grounds to void the entire R.B. trading arrangement going back to 1813. Combined with the incorporation record under her maiden name, you're looking at deliberate fraud with predatory intent. He paused. And the tenant overcharges establish a pattern of conduct that will damage their credibility when they try to construct a defense. When we take it to the magistrate, Ruth said. Not if. Cord looked at her. You understand, Miss Ellison, that the moment this filing becomes public, Mrs. Ellison will respond. She will claim the accounts were misread, that you are unstable, Ruth said. Desperate. A woman acting out of grudge rather than accuracy. Yes. She's been preparing that story since before she put me in the coach. Ruth folded her hands on the table. Which is why the documentation needs to be complete before she knows we have it. Every entry sourced, every figure certified, every witness statement in writing. She needs to walk into the magistrate's hearing with no room left to construct an alternative version of events. Cord looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating something. Then he looked at Mercer. Where did you find her? She found herself, Mercer said. I just opened the records room. Ruth looked at the table and allowed herself a single private moment of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the same family. Then she picked up her pen. Shall we go through the Ulster County Survey records next? They went through the Ulster County Survey records next. It was near 10 o'clock when Cord finally gathered his papers and Mrs. Hale was summoned to show him to the guest room. Mercer stayed at the desk. Ruth was collecting her own notes at the far end of the table. The house was quiet. Amos had gone to bed an hour ago. The lamp between them was burning low. He confirmed everything, Mercer said. Yes, you knew he would. Ruth looked up. I hoped he would. There's a difference. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention she'd come to recognize over 2 weeks, the kind that wasn't performing interest, wasn't being polite, was simply the unguarded attention of someone who found another person genuinely worth watching. You've been afraid the whole time, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, stated with the same precision he applied to everything else. Ruth set her pen down. Of course I have. Specifically, she looked at him across the dying lamp. That I'd find everything, and it wouldn't be enough. That I'd build the case perfectly, and she'd walk in with a better story, and better witnesses, and better social standing. And the magistrate would look at an unmarried woman with 73 cents who spent 3 weeks in a recluse's house. And he'd decide the numbers meant less than the narrative. She paused. I've watched people with better stories defeat people with better facts my entire life. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is that why you insisted on the contract? The first day. Yes, because a contract makes a fact. A fact can't be overwritten by a better story. A contract? A witness, a wage receipt, a dated entry. Cord said it himself, the documentation needs to be complete before she knows we have it. Ruth looked at her hands. My father taught me that the only defense against people who control the narrative is to build something they can't narrate over. Something concrete. Something that exists in a courthouse record and requires a judge to officially ignore if they want to make it disappear. And your father, Mercer said carefully, never managed to build that fast enough. The lamp guttered. Ruth looked at it. No, she said, he didn't. Because he trusted the wrong people. And by the time he understood what they'd built around him, he was ill, and I was 19, and we had Beatrice in the house and nowhere to take it. She looked up. I am not 19 anymore, and I know exactly where to take it. Something crossed his face then, the same thing she'd seen briefly in the study. The door opening its single inch, but it didn't close this time. She sent you here to be broken, he said, and instead you built the case that's going to dismantle everything she spent 20 years constructing. Ruth looked at him steadily. She sent me to a house full of evidence and a man who was too honest to complete her scheme, she said. The error was entirely hers. The lamp went down further. Neither of them moved to replace it. Get some sleep, Mercer said finally. His voice was quiet. Cord wants to start on the mortgage records at 7, Ruth stood. She picked up her notes. She was nearly to the door when she heard the sound that stopped her completely, a sound from outside. From the direction of the river storehouse, the records room where she'd spent 2 weeks pulling the past into the light. A sound like something falling. Then faintly, the smell of smoke. She and Mercer reached the door at the same moment. The records room window was lit from the inside, with a yellow glow that had nothing to do with a lamp left burning. Mercer ran. Ruth was 2 steps behind him, and before she went through the door she turned and screamed for Amos with everything she had. Because she understood in that single horrifying instant that someone had known about William Cord's visit. Someone had known what the records room contained. And someone had decided that the fastest way to stop what she'd built was to burn it before morning. They got the fire out in 11 minutes. Ruth knew because she counted. Not deliberately, her mind had simply locked on to the numbers the way it always did when everything else was chaos. Measuring and recording, because that was the only form of control available to her in the dark. In the smoke, with Amos shouting orders across the courtyard, and Mercer hauling water buckets with his bad knee and not making a single sound about it. 11 minutes. 3 men, 2 women from the kitchen. And 1 attorney in his nightshirt, who turned out to be surprisingly effective with a wet blanket. The wastebasket near the eastern shelving was destroyed. The floor around it was scorched. The shelf directly above it had lost its bottom 2 boards. And the freight correspondence stored there, the 1,815 correspondence, specifically, had burned to ash and a smell that coated the back of Ruth's throat for the rest of the night. She stood in the doorway of the records room after it was over and cataloged what was gone. The 1,815 freight logs. Gone. The duplicate shipping receipts she hadn't yet cross-referenced. Gone. 3 folders of tenant correspondence from the North Farms. Gone. What was not gone, everything she had already moved to the study. Everything William Cord had reviewed and signed as witnessed copies. Everything she had organized, noted and summarized in her own hand over 2 weeks of work. Because she had been moving documents to the study every evening. Not because she'd anticipated arson, because she was tidy. And she didn't like leaving active working materials in a storage room overnight. The habit her father had built into her put things away properly. Always, because you never know when you'll need to find them quickly, had just saved the case. She turned and found Mercer standing behind her, reading her face with the focused attention of a man taking inventory. What did we lose, he said. The 1,815 freight logs, Ruth said. The duplicate shipping receipts for that year. 3 folders from the North Farms. She paused. Nothing I hadn't already summarized. Nothing Cord hadn't already reviewed. Mercer looked at the scorched shelf. Then he looked at her. You moved everything to the study. Every evening, Ruth said. I don't leave active materials in storage. He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said, "Someone wanted the 1,815 records specifically." "Yes." "Which tells us something important." Ruth turned away from the doorway. "They knew exactly which year contained the most dangerous evidence. Not someone who heard a general rumor that you were having your accounts reviewed. Someone who knew the contents well enough to identify the most damaging specific documents." "Pike," Amos said from behind them. He'd come up quietly the way he always moved. "Or someone who reports to him," Ruth said. "Someone who came through the River Storehouse entrance." "Which means someone who knew that route existed." Mercer's voice went flat. "That entrance was known to exactly 4 people before I dismissed Pike. Pike, his assistant Amos, and myself." Then his assistant Amos said, "Is worth a conversation." Mercer looked at him. "Tom Greer. He's been working a farm in Claremont since March. I can have him here by morning ride tonight," Mercer said. "Don't tell him why." Amos was gone before the sentence finished. Ruth looked at the scorched floor one more time. She thought about whoever had stood in that room in the dark, setting a lit taper to the wastebasket, believing that fire could undo 2 weeks of methodical work. "They're frightened," she said. "Good," Mercer said. And his voice had an edge in it she hadn't heard before, not anger. "Exactly, but something colder and more purposeful. Frightened people make mistakes." Ruth turned back toward the house. "I'm going to rewrite the 1,815 summary from memory tonight while it's fresh. Can you have Mrs. Hale bring coffee to the study? It's past 11. Then it's going to be a long night," Ruth said, and walked toward the house with her notes pressed against her chest and the smell of smoke still in her hair. Tom Greer arrived at 7 in the morning with Amos behind him, and the expression of a man who has spent the night deciding how much trouble he's actually in. Ruth had been awake the entire time. She'd rewritten the 1,815 summary from memory. Cross-referenced it against everything in the study. Found 2 entries she'd initially missed, and had a clean fair copy ready for Cord before the sun came through the window. Cord, to his credit, had also stayed up. He reviewed the rewritten summary over coffee with the focused thoroughness of a man who understood that what he'd witnessed last night changed the nature of the proceeding. "Attempted destruction of evidence," he said. "That's not a civil matter anymore." "No," Ruth said. "It isn't." Tom Greer sat across from Mercer in the study with his hat on his knee and his eyes moving between the 3 people watching him with an uncomfortable awareness that there were no good options left to him. He was young, mid-20s, red-haired, with the kind of face that communicated everything he was trying to hide. Ruth watched him for 90 seconds and understood him completely. "Mr. Greer," she said quietly, "I'm going to tell you what I know. And then I'm going to tell you what I need. And then you're going to make a decision." He looked at her. He'd expected Mercer to speak first. That was interesting. "I know that Daniel Pike contacted you after you left this property. I know he asked you to report on what was happening at Blackthorn Hall, who was reviewing accounts. What was being found when documents were being moved." She paused. "And I know that someone entered the River Storehouse last night through the route you used to use when you brought freight logs to Pike after hours. I know this because the padlock on that route was opened without forcing. Which means a key was used, and the only person outside this household who would still have that key is someone who worked here when Pike ran the records room." Greer's face was a study in escalating distress. "I didn't set the fire," he said. "It came out fast." "Defensive." "I know," Ruth said, "because the person who set the fire knew exactly which shelf to burn. That knowledge is specific enough that it points to Pike himself. Or someone he briefed in detail. You were the informant. You reported that the 1,815 records were the most active part of the investigation. You may have even provided the key." She looked at him steadily. "But you didn't start the fire." Greer's hands were tight on his hat. "He told me it was just to know what was happening." "I didn't think." "No," Ruth said. "You didn't think it would go this far." Silence. Mercer hadn't spoken. He was sitting behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface, watching Greer with an expression Ruth had come to recognize as the controlled version of something considerably less controlled underneath. "Here is what I need," Ruth said. "A written statement of every communication you had with Pike after you left this property. Dates, content, method, if he came to you in person. Describe the meeting. If he sent letters, I need them." She paused. "In return, Mr. Cord has advised me that a cooperative witness who provides useful testimony before charges are filed stands in a considerably different position than one who provides it after." Cord nodded from his chair. Greer looked at Mercer. "Don't look at me," Mercer said. His voice was quiet. "Miss Ellison is running this inquiry." It was the first time he'd said it explicitly. Ruth felt the weight of it settle without looking at him. Greer looked back at Ruth. "Pike came to me twice," Greer said. "The second time he brought someone with him. A woman. She didn't give her name." Ruth's hands were very still on her notes. "Describe her," she said. Greer described her. Ruth wrote the name Beatrice Ellison in her notes, underlined it once, and did not let a single thing show in her face. Cord drafted Greer's statement in 2 hours and had it signed and witnessed before noon. By 1 o'clock, Ruth knew 2 things she hadn't known at midnight. The first, Beatrice had been in direct contact with Pike within 10 days of Ruth's arrival at Blackthorn Hall. She hadn't waited for Charles Vale's report. She'd gone herself, or sent word through a route she'd established years before, because she'd known from the moment she put Ruth in that coach that the timeline was accelerating and the accounts were dangerous. The second, Beatrice was already traveling. She had left Albany 2 days ago. She was, according to the innkeeper Greer had spoken to, heading south along the river road, south, toward Blackthorn Hall. Ruth sat with that information for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stood up. "She's coming here." Cord looked up from his papers. "Mrs. Ellison is traveling toward this property," Ruth said. "She received word from Pike that the fire didn't accomplish what she needed. She's coming to manage it herself." Mercer crossed to the door. Amos needs to know, Ruth agreed. "But more importantly, William," she looked at Cord, "we need everything finalized before she arrives. Every certified copy, every witness statement, every figure sourced and signed." She looked at the stack of documentation on the study desk. "How long?" "Assessed if we work without stopping." "Tomorrow morning." "Then we work without stopping," Ruth said. She sat back down at the desk and picked up her pen. Beatrice Ellison arrived the following afternoon. She arrived with Lydia and Francis, a hired attorney named Creswell, who wore an expensive coat and a self-important expression, and a county constable she had somehow persuaded to accompany her, on the grounds that a concerned mother had reason to believe her stepdaughter was being held against her will. Ruth heard the carriages on the drive. She was in the study. She did not go to the window. She gathered her documentation into a clean, ordered stack. She straightened her dress. She looked at William Cord across the desk. "Ready," he said simply. She nodded. Mercer appeared in the doorway. He'd changed his coat, which Ruth noticed because she noticed everything, and because the deliberate formality of it told her he understood what the next hour required. "They're in the front parlor," he said. "She's brought Creswell and a constable." "I know Creswell," Cord said. "He's theatrical and not particularly careful with his research." "Perfect," Ruth said. She picked up her documentation. "Shall we?" Beatrice had positioned herself in the center of the parlor with the practiced instinct of a woman who understood the architecture of social performance. She wore dark gray, not quite mourning, but adjacent to it, the color of a woman burdened by concern. Lydia sat to her right, pale and very still. Francis sat to her left, watching Ruth enter with an expression that could not decide between guilt and relief. The constable stood near the door. He was a broad-faced man named Aldrich, who looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested he'd been given an account of this situation that he was already beginning to doubt. Creswell rose when Ruth entered. He was tall, well-fed, and wore his confidence the way bad attorneys always did, as though volume and bearing could substitute for preparation. "Miss Ellison," he said, "I'm glad to see you in good health. Your stepmother has been desperately worried." Ruth set her documentation on the side table. She looked at Beatrice. Beatrice looked back at her with an expression of calculated maternal distress that Ruth had watched her construct and deploy for 8 years. The soft eyes, the pained mouth, the careful positioning of grief. "Ruth," Beatrice said. Her voice was perfectly calibrated. "My darling, this has gone much further than I ever intended. I only want to bring you home." Ruth said nothing. Mercer beside her also said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Creswell stepped into it. "Mr. Mercer, I represent Mrs. Ellison's interests in this matter. She has significant concerns about the circumstances under which her stepdaughter has remained in this house, and she intends to petition the county court for temporary guardianship of Miss Ellison's person and remaining property interests. Pending a full review of her." "On what grounds?" Cord said. Creswell blinked. He hadn't expected Cord. "I'm sorry." "And you are William Cord, attorney, Kingston. I've been retained by Mr. Mercer and Miss Ellison." Cord set his own papers on the table beside Ruth's. "On what grounds does Mrs. Ellison seek guardianship?" Creswell recovered. "Miss Ellison's mental and emotional stability has been a matter of family concern since her father's death. She has been producing a complete forensic accounting of 6 years of systematic fraud conducted against Mr. Mercer's estate and against her own legally protected inheritance," Ruth said. Her voice was clear and entirely steady. "I have the documentation here. I'd be glad to walk you through it." Beatrice's expression shifted. Just slightly. The maternal distress remained, but something underneath it sharpened. "Ruth," she said softly, "you've always had such a talent for numbers. But numbers can be misread, especially by someone who has been under strain." "These haven't been misread," Ruth said. "They've been certified by Mr. Cord, witnessed by Mr. Amos Reed, and reviewed against original courthouse filings. Would you like to start with the tenant overcharges? Or with the promissory note my father wrote for my trust that ended up as a loan in Daniel Pike's freight accounts?" The room was very quiet. Constable Aldrich shifted his weight near the door. Creswell said carefully, "I'm not sure what Miss Ellison believes she has found. But what she has found," Cord said, "is sufficient grounds for a criminal complaint against Daniel Pike for fraud, forgery, and arson against Mrs. Ellison's brother for his role in establishing R.B. Trading Company, and against Mrs. Ellison herself, who appears in the original incorporation filing under her maiden name as a founding partner." He opened his folder. "The filing date predates her marriage to Thomas Ellison by 6 months. The color in Beatrice's face did not drain. It relocated. It concentrated around her eyes in a way that Ruth recognized as the particular furious calculation of a person deciding how to pivot. Creswell leaned down to Beatrice and said something low. Beatrice shook her head once, sharply. "These are accusations," Beatrice said. Her voice had changed. The softness was gone. A desperate young woman producing documents she claims to have found in an old storehouse after weeks alone in a strange man's house is not a legal proceeding. "No," Ruth said. "It isn't, which is why we've scheduled one." Beatrice looked at her. "The county magistrate has been contacted," Cord said. "We have a hearing date set for 3 weeks from today. All documentation has been formally submitted under my signature." He paused. "At this point, any attempt to remove Miss Ellison from this property against her will, or to interfere with her documentation or testimony, would constitute obstruction of a pending legal proceeding," Constable Aldrich said. He stopped. He looked at Creswell. "Is that accurate?" Creswell did not answer immediately. Aldrich looked back at Ruth. He looked at the stack of organized documentation on the table. He looked at Cord. He looked at the constable's evident discomfort of a man who has been brought to enforce something he's rapidly concluding is not what he was told it was. "Ma'am," he said to Ruth, directly, with the careful courtesy of a man correcting his course. "Are you here of your own free will?" "I am employed here under a written contract," Ruth said. "I came here involuntarily under a forged letter. I have chosen to remain voluntarily." Aldrich nodded. He took a step back toward the door. Creswell made one more attempt. "The documents themselves may be questioned. The boundary survey discrepancy can't be questioned," Ruth said. She pulled a single page from her documentation and set it on the table facing Creswell. "The R.B. Trading Agreement references a property line adjustment in Ulster County, citing income from a mill that my father did not purchase until 6 months after this document's alleged signing date. The mill did not exist when this document claims it was negotiated." She looked at him. "You cannot negotiate property around a mill that hasn't been built yet. That is not a question of interpretation. That is a question of chronology." Creswell looked at the page. He said nothing. Beatrice said very quietly, "Ruth, I am still your mother's place." It was the cruelest thing she could have said, and she knew it. Ruth felt it land in the exact place it was aimed at, the place where a 20-year-old girl had stood in a cold parlor and been told that her father's death was a burden she was expected to absorb quietly and without complaint. Ruth looked at her stepmother across the room. "You were never my mother's place," Ruth said. Her voice did not waver. "And you are no longer anyone's threat." It was Lydia who broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. She simply stood up from her chair and said, "Mother, I can't." Beatrice turned to her. "Lydia, I can't." Lydia's voice shook. But she kept going with the particular courage of someone who has been choosing silence for too long and has finally run out of reasons to continue. "I practiced his signature. You know I practiced it. You sat with me at the writing table for 3 evenings, and you told me it was for correspondence. That it was simply so documents wouldn't be delayed." She looked at Ruth. "She told me your father had authorized everything. She told me the trust arrangement was his idea." The room was absolutely still. "Lydia," Beatrice said, low and dangerous. "She made me practice until it matched well enough," Lydia said to Ruth. And her voice broke on the last word. "I didn't know what it was for. I didn't know until I saw what she did with I didn't understand." Ruth looked at her stepsister. Lydia was 20 years old and pale, and she had spent her entire adolescence in her mother's particular gravitational field. The kind that makes people orbit without ever quite choosing to. "Do you have anything in writing?" Ruth said quietly. "Any of the letters she sent you? Any notes from those evenings?" Lydia reached into her reticule with trembling hands. She produced a folded paper. She held it out to Ruth. It was a note in Beatrice's handwriting. "Practice the lower loop more. The T must cross lower." Again Ruth took it. She passed it to Cord without looking away from Lydia. "Thank you," Ruth said simply. "Without performance." Lydia sat back down. She did not look at her mother. Beatrice stood very still. The performance of maternal concern had collapsed entirely. What remained underneath it was harder and colder, and considerably more real. "You want money," she said to Ruth. Flat, direct. The social architecture of their entire history stripped away. "Name a figure." The silence that followed was the most clarifying silence Ruth had experienced in her life. Mercer behind her made a sound that was not quite a word. She held up one hand without turning, and he went quiet. "No," Ruth said. Then what Beatrice said. "What do you want?" "Satisfaction? You want to stand in a courthouse and humiliate me and have everyone know I want what my father set aside for me," Ruth said. "I want the trust principal returned with 3 years of interest at the standard rate. I want the boundary adjustment voided and the Ulster County property line restored. I want the tenant families compensated for every fraudulent overcharge with interest." She paused. "And I want Daniel Pike prosecuted for arson and fraud. I won't negotiate on that point." Beatrice's jaw tightened. "And if I agree to your terms, then I will not seek additional damages against you personally. Mr. Cord will draft the agreement. Lydia and Frances will not be named in any proceeding." Ruth looked at her steadily. Your daughters are not responsible for what you built. Something crossed Beatrice's face Ruth had never seen there before. It was not remorse. She didn't think Beatrice was capable of remorse in any recognizable form. It was the expression of a person confronting a reality they had genuinely not prepared for. The reality of being stopped by the girl they'd spent 8 years treating as furniture. Creswell said quietly to Beatrice, "I'd recommend considering the terms." Beatrice looked at Ruth for a long moment. She looked at the documentation on the table. She looked at Cord's folder. She looked at Lydia, who was staring at the floor. She looked at Constable Aldrich, who had the resigned expression of a man who came here to escort someone, and has concluded he will be escorting no one. "Your father," Beatrice said finally, "would be very proud of you. He always thought you were remarkable." Her voice was careful. "Calibrated, even now. I hope that's some comfort." Ruth looked at her. "It is," Ruth said, "which is exactly why I'm not stopping." Creswell drew Beatrice out of the parlor for a private conference that lasted 35 minutes. Ruth sat at the side table and reviewed her documentation one more time. Not because it needed reviewing, because her hands needed something to do, and this was the most useful available option. Mercer came and stood near her, not close enough to hover, close enough to be present. "She tried to buy you," he said quietly. "She always tries to buy things," Ruth said. "It's the only leverage she knows how to use." You didn't hesitate. There was nothing to hesitate about. Ruth turned a page. "She can restore what's mine, or she can explain herself to the magistrate. Those are simple choices." He was quiet for a moment. "Lydia," he said. Ruth looked at the far corner where Lydia sat alone, her hands folded, her mother on the other side of the wall. Frances had moved to sit beside her, not speaking. Just there. "She's been carrying that since before she knew what it was," Ruth said. "She needs to be out from under it." "You could have used it harder," Mercer said. "The signature practice. In the Hirno," Ruth said. "I chose not to. There's a difference between the evidence I need and the damage I'm willing to do to an innocent person to get it." He looked at her with that particular quality of attention she'd stopped pretending wasn't meaningful. "You've been in this house for 3 weeks," he said. "You came here to be destroyed. And instead, you built the thing that's going to bring down a 20-year fraud while simultaneously protecting the people your enemy used as weapons." Ruth set down her pen. She looked at the wall. "My father raised me to read what numbers actually say," she said. "Not what people claim they say. Not what it's convenient for them to say." She looked at her hands on the documentation. "Numbers don't have interests. They don't have social ambitions or grudges or fear of consequences. They just say what happened." She paused. "I'm trying to do the same." Mercer said nothing. But she felt the weight of his attention like a hand placed carefully on a closed door. The parlor door opened. Creswell appeared. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "is prepared to discuss terms. It took 2 hours to draft the agreement." Cord and Creswell circled each other like men who had been in opposite corners before and had opinions about the experience. Beatrice sat in her chair with the particular stillness of a woman who has accepted a defeat while refusing to accept the emotion that belongs to it. Ruth sat across from her and walked through every term with Cord's precision and her own absolute refusal to be hurried, flattered or pressured. The trust principle, restored, with interest calculated from the date of the first fraudulent entry. The Ulster County boundary, voided with a new survey to be commissioned within 60 days. The tenant overcharges compensated in full within 30 days, with Amos Reed certifying the final figures. Daniel. Criminal charges to proceed. Lydia and Frances. Named in no proceeding, provided Lydia's written testimony was submitted voluntarily and without further request. Beatrice signed. She signed with her own hand, in her own name, with Creswell and Cord and Constable Aldrich witnessing. Ruth watched the pen move across the paper and felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled. Something old and deep, from the morning she'd sat in her father's study and added the last column of figures and found For the first time, the entry that didn't reconcile. It was done. Not finished, the magistrate hearing remained, and Pike remained, and the Ulster County survey had to be commissioned and certified. And there were 30 days of tenant repayments to oversee. But the architecture was in place. The document existed. The numbers said what they said, and no subsequent story could overwrite them. Beatrice stood. She looked at Ruth one final time. She didn't say walked out. Lydia was the last to leave. She stopped in front of Ruth with the expression of someone who has just stepped off a very long bridge and is still calculating whether they survived the fall. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it, for everything I knew and didn't say." Ruth looked at her. "You said it when it mattered," she said. "That counts for something." Lydia nodded. Her eyes were bright. She turned and followed her mother. The front door closed. Ruth stood in the parlor in the silence that came after, with Cord closing his folder and Aldrich saying his careful, relieved goodbyes and Amos appearing in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been listening from the hall and feels entirely justified about it. Mercer came to stand beside her. He looked at the closed door. He looked at the signed agreement in Cord's hand. "Is it over?" he asked. "This part," Ruth said. He nodded. Then Ruth walked to the side table and picked up her documentation, her notes. Her certified copies, her father's letters with his careful accountant's hand, and held them against her chest for a moment, with her eyes closed. She had built the case her father never got to build. She had brought the numbers into the light where they could be properly named. When she opened her eyes, Mercer was watching her. Not with the professional attention she'd catalogued for 3 weeks. With something that had been building for 3 weeks, and had, somewhere in the last 2 hours, run out of room to stay contained. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but when Mrs. Hale appeared at the doorway and said that supper was ready, and the lamp in the hall was lit, and the house was quiet again, Ruth walked beside him down the corridor, with her father's papers still held close. And the weight of what she'd just done settled into something that felt improbably like the beginning of rest. She did not notice, until she passed the study doorway, that the chair by the window, the desk chair that Mercer had moved closer to the light 3 weeks ago, without being asked now, had her initials worked into the turned wood of its back. She stopped. She looked at it when she said, "First week," Mercer said beside her. "Amos did the carving. He has opinions about things being permanent." Ruth looked at the chair with her initials in the wood. She thought about arriving at this house with 73 cents and a forged letter. Braced for contempt, offered instead a seat by a fire. She looked at Mercer. He was already looking at her. He had been, she suspected, for quite some time. "Supper," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked down the hall together, and the lamp burned steady behind them, and somewhere in the records room the smell of old smoke still hung in the air like the last visible trace of a plan that had not survived contact with a woman who knew how to read what numbers actually said. The morning after Beatrice left, Ruth found an envelope on her writing table. She hadn't heard anyone come in. She'd actually slept. The deep and dreamless kind she hadn't managed in 3 weeks. And when she woke, the house was quiet, and the envelope was there with her name written on it in Mercer's hand. Not Miss Ellison. Ruth, the same way he'd said it in the stable. Like a door opening its single inch. She opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a transfer of funds, her trust principal, plus 3 years of calculated interest, moved into an account held in her name alone at the Albany Merchant Bank. The figure was real. She'd calculated it herself. Seeing it formalized in bank script with her own name attached to it produced a sensation she hadn't anticipated. Something between vertigo and the particular steadiness that comes when you've been bracing against a wind for so long then you've forgotten what still air feels like. The second document was a letter of introduction to a merchant firm in Albany, Hartwell and Associates, importers and freight brokers, recommending Miss Ruth Ellison as a skilled accounts manager available for permanent placement. The letter was signed by both Mercer and William Cord. It described her qualifications with the spare precision of men who understood that understatement carried more weight than praise. She read both documents twice. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and held them in her lap and looked at the window where the morning was coming through clear and unhurried. And she understood exactly what Jonathan Mercer had done. He had given her the door, not pushed her through it. Not closed it behind her. Given her the door, opened it fully. Stepped back and removed every possible reason she might stay. That wasn't a reason she'd chosen for herself. She found him in the stable. Of course she did. He was checking the bay gelding's left foreleg with the focused attention of a man who uses physical tasks to manage the things he can't say directly. He didn't look up when she came in, which meant he'd heard her, and was choosing the particular cowardice of pretending he hadn't. "The bank transfer," she said. "Cord certified it yesterday before he left. It's effective immediately. And the Hartwell letter. They're a good firm. Fair wages, legitimate work, nothing like what you've been doing here, but a solid professional position. You'd have your own lodging, independence." Ruth stood with both documents in her hand. "You did all this last night." "I had time," he said. "You were asleep, Jonathan." He stopped. He straightened. He turned, and for the first time in 4 weeks she saw his face without the professional composure that was his default armor in occupied rooms. What was underneath it was neither comfortable nor hidden. "I'm not going to make your decision for you," he said. "I've watched someone make your decisions for you for 3 weeks. And I understand exactly what that costs. You have money. You have a reference. You have options that are real and don't require this house or my name or anyone's approval." He looked at her steadily. "I needed you to have those things before anything else." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "You thought I might leave," she said. "I think you should have the genuine option," he said. "There's a difference, and if I take it..." He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Then I'll be glad I gave it to you," he said. "And I'll be lying about that for a considerable time. But I'll be glad nonetheless." Ruth looked down at the documents in her hand. She looked at the bank transfer with her name on it. She looked at the letter of introduction that would take her to Albany, and a respectable room and work she could do, and wages she could keep, and a life that was entirely, undeniably hers. She looked at the man who had built that life for her, and stepped back from it so she could choose it freely. "I need to go to Albany," she said. Something moved in his face. "For the magistrate hearing," she continued. "Cord needs me for the final testimony on the Pike proceeding. And I want to review the Hartwell position myself before I make any decisions. I want to see the office, meet the partners, understand what the work actually is." He nodded. "Careful. How long?" he said. 3 weeks. Possibly 4. "I'll need my documentation," she said. "And a reference letter for the court clerk from Amos. I'll have Amos write it today." Ruth folded both documents and held them against her chest. "Jonathan." He looked at her. "The chair with my initials," she said. "Did you actually ask Amos to carve them, or did he do it on his own?" The corner of his mouth moved. "He informed me he was doing it," he said. "I didn't stop him." "That's not the same as asking." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him one more moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the house to begin packing. And she did not look back, because if she looked back she would not leave. And she needed to leave, because the only way to know that staying was a choice and not a dependency was to go somewhere else first, and find out what it felt like to stand on her own ground. Albany in September was loud and purposeful and entirely indifferent to Ruth Ellison's particular history. She arrived on a Tuesday, rented a room in a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Crane, who had strong opinions about dinner times and absolutely no opinions about what her boarders did professionally, and presented herself at Hartwell and Associates the following morning with her documentation under her arm and William Cord's letter in her hand. The senior partner, a compact man named Edmund Hartwell, who had the organized attention of someone who had spent 40 years, make us rapid assessments of whether people were worth his time, interviewed her for 2 hours. He gave her a test 3 years of his own accounts with deliberate errors introduced at irregular intervals and watched her work. She found 11 errors in 40 minutes. He'd introduced 9. The other 2, he said, are mine. Genuine errors I made in 1,814 that my own clerk missed. He looked at her. How? The column pattern breaks twice in ways that aren't consistent with the surrounding entries, Ruth said. The first is a carrying error, probably made on a day with multiple interruptions. The second is a figure transposition that's easy to generate when you're working from a draft that's been corrected more than once. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. Miss Ellison, I'm going to offer you a position. I'm going to pay you the same wage I pay my senior clerk, who has been with me for 12 years and is about to retire to his sister's farm in Saratoga County. I am doing this not as charity, but because the alternative is hiring someone else who will take considerably longer to find my 1,814 errors and will never find them as well, Ruth said. I'd like a written contract. Hartwell smiled for the first time. William Cord told me you'd say that. She started the following Monday. The work at Hartwell's was different from Blackthorn Hall, the way that a river is different from the Hudson, same essential nature. Different scale, different banks. The firm moved freight from the Hudson Valley to New York City and ran import accounts for 3 merchant families whose financial arrangements had accumulated the particular comfortable disorder of old money that had never needed to be careful. Ruth found the disorder interesting, not infuriating. The way Beatrice's deliberate falsifications had been infuriating. But genuinely interesting, the way a tangled line is interesting, once you find the first loop that releases the rest. She also discovered, in that first week at Hartwell's, that professional respect and social acceptance were different animals. 2 of the 3 merchant families whose accounts she managed sent their correspondence to Hartwell, addressed to his senior clerk. Male name assumed. When they came in person and found Ruth at the desk, 2 of them asked Hartwell when the regular person would return. One of them asked her directly whether she was certain she understood commercial freight terms. She showed him the reconciled accounts. He stopped asking. But she understood, walking back to Mrs. Crane's on Friday evening of the first week, that this was what independence, without connection, felt like. Accurate and sufficient and real and deeply, specifically lonely, in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the simple human fact that useful work was not the same as being known. She'd been known at Blackthorn Hall. She sat with that distinction for 3 evenings and refused to simplify it. Mercer's first letter arrived on the 8th day. It was, as she'd half expected and wholly hoped, entirely professional in its surface content. The Ulster County Survey had been commissioned. The tenant repayments were on schedule. Amos had certified the first 3 family compensations and expected to complete the remaining 4 by the end of the month. The mill's autumn freight was running on the corrected account system she'd established. The last paragraph was 4 sentences. The dog has taken your chair. I have relocated him twice, and he returns each time with what I can only describe as legal conviction. The kitchen garden produced more winter squash than Mrs. Hale considers reasonable. The study is very quiet in the evenings. Ruth read the last sentence twice. Then she set the letter down and looked at the ceiling of her room at Mrs. Crane's and stayed very still for a considerable time. She wrote back. She reported on the Hartwell position, the magistrate hearing schedule, the initial review of the Pike criminal complaint that Cord had filed formally in Kingston. She described the merchant who'd questioned her competence and what she'd done about it. She asked about the Harmon family's compensation and whether Mrs. Harmon had received the full amount or whether Amos had split it across 2 payments. Her last sentence was 4 words, "Move the dog yourself." His reply came in 6 days. The dog, he reported, had opinions. The Harmon family had received their full compensation in a single payment. Mrs. Harmon had sent a jar of preserved plums in return. which Amos had accepted with the specific dignity of a man who was feeling something he intended it to feel privately. The North Farm fence line had been repaired ahead of the first frost. He'd started on his injury-proper treatment. A physician from Hudson, who had practical rather than decorative opinions about the knee, because someone had told him that being in pain and being broken were not the same condition, and he had apparently decided to believe it. "The study is still quiet in the evenings," he wrote. "I find I have developed a strong opinion about this." Ruth held the letter over Mrs. Crane's breakfast table and read that last sentence 3 times. The widow, who was 71 and had not survived to 71 by failing to observe the obvious, poured Ruth's coffee and said, without looking up, "Letter from someone significant, I take it." "Professional correspondence," Ruth said. "Of course," Mrs. Crane said. Ruth folded the letter and put it in her pocket and did not examine the fact that she kept it there for the rest of the day. The magistrate hearing for Daniel Pike happened on the 19th day. Ruth testified for 2 hours. She had been afraid of this, not of the testimony itself, but of the room, the formality, the particular social ritual of a legal proceeding where an unmarried woman presenting financial evidence against a man with established professional connections had to navigate the space between being believed and being dismissed as clever but unreliable. She walked into it and did what she always did. She showed the numbers. She walked the magistrate through the entry patterns, the consistent ink variation, the page gaps, the tenant overcharge calculations, the RB, Trading Incorporation record, the boundary survey discrepancy involving the mill that hadn't existed at the date of the alleged agreement. She was direct, specific, and entirely unemotional. Cord said afterward that she was the best witness he'd ever put before a county magistrate. Not because she was persuasive, but because she was impossible to confuse. Every question the opposing counsel attempted was met with a document, a date or a figure that required him to retreat and recalibrate. Pike's attorney tried twice to characterize her as a woman with a grudge manufacturing a case out of ambition and wounded pride. The magistrate looked at the documentation and asked whether counsel had a specific numerical challenge to raise. Counsel did not. Pike was remanded for criminal trial. The motion was granted on all counts: fraud, forgery, and arson of records. Ruth walked out of the courthouse into the September afternoon, with Cord beside her and her father's letters in her bag, and the particular exhausted clarity that comes after something you've been building toward for weeks, finally, irrevocably, happens. "Your father would have called that a clean column," Cord said. Ruth looked at the river in the distance. "Yes," she said. "He would have." She went back to Mrs. Crane's. She sat at the writing table. She started a letter to Mercer. She wrote and discarded 4 versions before she understood that what she was trying to say could not be adequately contained in the professional register they'd been conducting their correspondence in for 3 weeks. She wrote the 5th version in 20 minutes without stopping. She told him about the hearing, about Pike's attorney and the magistrate's question, and the moment when she'd understood that the documentation was simply too complete to be argued around. She told him about the merchant who'd questioned her competence in the Hartwell accounts, and the way that useful work and being known were 2 separate things she'd spent 3 weeks learning to distinguish. She told him that Mrs. Crane had described her letters from him as significant correspondence, and that she had claimed professional relevance with considerably less confidence than she would have liked. She told him that the study being quiet in the evenings was, in her experience, a correctable condition. She stopped before she signed it. She looked at what she'd written. Then she added 1 line. "I am coming back because I want to, not because I must. I thought you should know the difference before I arrive." She sealed it and sent it before she could revise it into something safer. The reply came in 5 days. Fastest yet. It was the shortest letter he'd sent. "I know the difference. I have known it for some time. Come home." The last 2, Ruth read them at Mrs. Crane's breakfast table on a Thursday morning with the widow, pretending to be entirely absorbed in her toast and failing comprehensively. Professional correspondence, Ruth said. Naturally, said Mrs. Ruth folded the letter. She looked at the window. She looked at the room she'd made functional and clean and entirely her own over 22 days. She looked at the bank transfer in her document folder, her money. Her name, real and permanent and not contingent on anyone's goodwill. She looked at the Hartwell contract on the writing table, which had a 30-day termination clause she had specifically negotiated. She looked at the letter in her hand. Then she went and told Edmund Hartwell that she was returning to the Hudson Valley. And she thanked him for a position that had been exactly what she needed it to be. And she asked whether he would accept correspondence accounts from a private estate management if she found herself in the position of needing to refer work. Hartwell said, "Tell whoever runs that estate they have remarkable luck." "I'll tell him," Ruth said. "He'll disagree, smart man," said Hartwell. She arrived at Blackthorn Hall on a Friday afternoon, unannounced because she hadn't sent word of her exact travel day. The coach let her at the gate, and she walked the drive herself with her bag in hand, and the trust documents in her satchel, and the particular quality of attention she was paying to her own feelings, which were numerous and not entirely comfortable and entirely real. Amos was at the fence line. He saw her before she reached the house. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man whose opinion of events he is not going to state aloud. "He's in the study," Amos said. "Thank you," Ruth said. "Finished the last tenant payment yesterday," he said. "All 7 families. Good." She paused. "The Harmon family?" Mrs. Harmon sent another jar of plums. Amos's mouth moved fractionally. "We're developing a surplus," Ruth almost smiled. She walked on to the house. Mrs. Hale opened the door before Ruth knocked, which meant she'd been watching from the hall window and had strong feelings about pretending otherwise. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Hale said. "There's tea in the parlor." A pause. "He's been in the study since 9 this morning." "I know," Ruth said. "Thank you." She went upstairs first. She set her bag down in her room, which was exactly as she'd left it. Her writing table was clear. The window was cracked for air. On the table was a small piece of paper weighted down by a river stone. She picked it up. It was a receipt, written in Mercer's hand. Dated the previous Monday. Received in good faith. 1 desk chair temporarily occupied. Occupant expected to return and reclaim. J. Below that, in different ink, added later. The dog disagrees. He has filed a counterclaim. Ruth stood in her room with that receipt in her hand and felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't fully acknowledged was knotted. She set it back on the table. She went back downstairs. The study door was open. Mercer was at his desk, not pretending to read, actually reading. The estate journal from the looks of it, making margin notes in his characteristic blunt hand. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the first evening, the steady, careful, entirely undisguised look of a man who had decided that pretending to see less than he saw was a waste of both their time. "You didn't send word," he said. "I know." She came into the room. "I wanted it to be a choice, not an arrival." He set down his pen. He stood. He looked at her across the desk with the documents of his estate around him, and the lamp lit against afternoon, and every professional boundary they'd maintained for 6 weeks dissolved by the simple fact of her being back in this room of her own free choosing. "Ruth," he said. "I read your letters," she said. "All of them." "Several times. I know, I read yours. The study being quiet in the evening," she said. "Is that still a condition?" "It's been a condition for 22 days, he said. "I have developed extremely strong opinions about it." She looked at him steadily. "I have money," she said, "my own, protected in my own name. I have a professional reference. I have a position I could return to in Albany, and a room I could rent, and a life that is entirely, genuinely mine without this house or your name or anyone's charity." "I know," he said. I need you to know that I know it, she said before anything else. I do know it, he said. I built it that way on purpose. Ruth looked at him across the desk. She thought about a coach in August, a forged letter, 73 cents in her glove, and a man who had looked at a shivering woman braced for contempt and offered her a chair instead. She thought about numbers and what they said when no one was lying. Jonathan, she said, ask me. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her close enough that she could see the particular lines of his face. The scar settled into the jaw, the gray eyes that had been reading her honestly since the first day. And he looked at her with everything he'd been holding behind professional distance and careful letters and receipts left on writing tables. I can give you partnership in this estate, he said. Written authority, shared management, your name on every document that comes out of this property. Your accounts, your contracts, your decisions. A marriage settlement drafted by Cord that protects everything you have before you set foot in any church. He paused. But I am not asking you for any of those reasons. Ruth waited. I am asking you because this house became a home the day you stopped being afraid inside it, he said. And because I spent 22 days in a quiet study understanding that the thing I'd been missing since the war wasn't function or purpose. It was someone who saw me clearly and stayed anyway. He held her gaze. I am asking because you are the first person in my adult life who treated my injury as a fact rather than a verdict. And the first person who corrected my arithmetic without apology. And the first person whose presence in a room made me feel like I was in a room rather than occupying a building. The lamp burned steady between them. Will you stay, he said. Not because you must. Not because it's practical. Because you want to. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father's voice. You will always be able to find your own way. She thought about the numbers and what they said. She thought about 22 days in Albany and useful work and the difference between sufficient and chosen. She thought about a receipt on a writing table. Occupant expected to return and reclaim. I will stay, she said, because you were the first person to give me a choice. And because every time you could have taken it back, you didn't. She held his gaze. And because the study being quiet in the evenings is, as I said in my letter, a correctable condition. He reached out. He took her hand, the one that had been prepped a carriage wall in August with 73 cents hidden in the glove, and held it with the careful steadiness of a man who understands the difference between holding and keeping. Cord can have the settlement drafted by Wednesday, he said. Tuesday, Ruth said. I've already thought through the terms. He almost smiled. Then he did smile fully, without the held-back fraction that had been its consistent qualifier since August, and Ruth understood that she would be cataloging that smile for a very long time. Tuesday, he agreed. Outside, the Hudson moved south toward the city, carrying Autumn with it. In the front parlor, the dog was on the chair, Ruth's chair, with the settled conviction of established occupation. Amos, passing the parlor doorway, looked at the dog. Looked toward the study where the voices had gone quiet in a way that communicated rather more than silence, and permitted himself one small private expression of professional satisfaction. Then he went to tell Mrs. Hale that there would be cause for a proper supper. William Cord had the marriage settlement drafted by Tuesday noon. It was 14 pages. Ruth had expected 12. She sat across from Cord at the study desk and read every word while Mercer stood at the window with his arms crossed, and the particular patience of a man who has learned that some processes cannot be hurried, and that attempting to hurry them produces worse outcomes than waiting. She found one clause she wanted modified, a provision regarding estate decisions that required her to consult Mercer before acting on accounts above a certain figure. Remove it, she said. Cord looked at her. It's standard protective language for the estate. It's not protective, Ruth said. It's supervisory. I have managed these accounts for 6 weeks without consultation requirements. The estate is healthier for it. If we're drafting a partnership, draft a partnership. She set the page down. remove the consultation clause and replace it with joint signature authority on capital transfers above $200. That protects the estate without creating a permission structure. Cord looked at Mercer. Mercer said, "Do what she says." Cord made the amendment without further discussion. He was a man who appreciated precision, and he was beginning to understand that Ruth Ellison's precision was not negotiating posture. It was simply how she operated. By Wednesday morning, the settlement was signed, witnessed by Amos and Mrs. Hale, and filed with the county clerk in Hudson. Ruth Ellison's recovered trust principal was listed as separate property, protected in perpetuity, not subject to marital claim. Her professional authority over Blackthorn Hall's accounts was written into the document with the same weight as any other contractual obligation. Her right to independent legal standing in any proceeding related to her own property was explicitly preserved. Cord shook her hand when it was done. He held it a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Your father," he said, "was a man who taught his daughter to build things that last." Ruth looked at the filed document in the clerk register. Her name, in ink, in a courthouse record, permanent and unambiguous and belonging entirely to herself. "He was," she said. "The wedding was on a Saturday in October, at the small Episcopal church 3 miles from the estate." Ruth wore deep blue wool, cut simply, with her mother's pearl earrings and her own money's worth of good leather boots that fit correctly. She had selected and purchased the dress herself at a shop in Hudson, whose proprietress had shown her 6 options and not once suggested that a woman of her age and circumstance ought to consider something more modest. She had tipped the woman generously on principle. Mercer wore his good coat and had, Amos reported with great solemnity, cleaned his boots without being asked. He stood at the front of the church with the upright bearing of a man who has been to war, and considers a church ceremony less frightening than a battlefield, only marginally. He watched her walk in. She watched him watch her. The expression on his face was the one she'd been cataloging since August, the door that kept opening wider. Millimeter by careful millimeter, until this morning when it was simply open. The whole thing, and he wasn't managing it anymore. She held his gaze the entire length of the aisle. The ceremony was brief and specific. The minister was a practical man who understood that Jonathan Mercer had not come to hear a homily, and that the woman beside him had read the relevant legal statutes and knew precisely what she was agreeing to. He kept it to the essential words when it was over. Mercer took her hand the same way he'd taken it 5 days ago in the study. Careful and deliberate, and held it with the steadiness of someone who has made a decision he intends to keep. "Mrs. Mercer," he said quietly, trying the name. "That's going to take some adjustment," she said. "Probably," he said. "I've been thinking of you as Ruth for 6 weeks. Then use it," she said. He almost smiled, then he did, Amos standing in the second pew with Mrs. Hale, exhaled with the carefully controlled satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for this particular outcome since approximately the 3rd day of September, and considers his patience entirely vindicated. Lydia came to the reception. She came alone, without Frances, without her mother. In a plain dress with her hair done simply, and an expression that sat somewhere between hope and the specific anxiety of someone who doesn't know whether they've been forgiven or merely tolerated. Ruth saw her in the doorway of the Mercer parlor and crossed the room. "You came," Ruth said. "I wasn't sure I should," Lydia said. "I wasn't sure after everything whether you would want Lydia," Ruth said. "You stood up in a room with your mother watching and told the truth. That cost you something real. I know what it costs to say the thing that can't be unsaid in front of the person who will punish you for it." She looked at her stepsister steadily. "You're here. That's where we start." Lydia pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. "She's in Albany," she said. "She's managing. She's furious, obviously. But she's managing." She hesitated. "She doesn't know I came today." "That's your business," Ruth said. "Not mine." Lydia looked around the parlor at Amos and Mrs. Hale and the tenant families who'd been invited, the Garretts and the Harmons, and 3 others. filling the room with the particular warmth of people who've been treated fairly and remember what it felt like when they weren't. You invited the tenants, Lydia said. They're part of the estate, Ruth said. They were part of what happened. They should be part of what comes after. Mrs. Harmon was across the room talking to Mercer with the direct ease of a woman who has received her compensation and her receipt and considers the accounting settled and the man holding it squared. Mercer was listening with the focused attention he gave everything that mattered. And Ruth could see from 20 feet away that Mrs. Harmon was telling him something about her late son, and that he was hearing it without flinching. He was not good at being thanked. He was learning, Ruth, Lydia said quietly. I'm sorry. For all of it. For all the years I watched and didn't speak. I know, Ruth said. I'm not carrying it anymore. She met her stepsister's eyes. You don't have to either. Lydia nodded. She swallowed. She reached into her reticule and produced a small package, neatly wrapped. It was your mother's, she said, your actual mother's. My mother kept it after your father died. I took it back 2 weeks ago when she wasn't at home. Her voice was steady. But her hands weren't. It belonged with you. Ruth opened the package. Inside was a small silver thimble, engraved on the base with initials she recognized from her father's letters. Her mother's thimble. The kind of object kept because it was handled and used and loved. Not because it was valuable. Ruth held it in her palm. She looked at it for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Not performed. Not managed. Simply the direct, undefended truth of it. Lydia's shoulders came down from where they'd been. Across the room, Mercer caught Ruth's eye. He didn't ask. He just looked. The way he'd been looking at her since August, reading her clearly. Not intervening, trusting her to handle what was hers to handle. She gave him a small nod. He went back to Mrs. Harmon. The first significant test of the marriage came 14 days in. And it came from a direction Ruth hadn't anticipated. It wasn't Beatrice. Beatrice had been quiet since the signed agreement. The way a person is quiet when they're calculating a new angle. But quiet nonetheless. It was the Albany social circuit. A gathering at the home of the county commissioner's wife, a woman named Mrs. Aldgate, who ran Albany's informal social architecture with the particular authority of someone who has never needed official title to exercise genuine power. An autumn dinner, 20 people, the kind of event where Hudson Valley families took each other's measure over good wine and careful conversation. Mercer had been invited. He rarely attended such things. He attended this one because Ruth was with him, and Ruth had accepted because she understood that Blackthorn Hall's standing in the valley affected the estate's commercial relationships. And commercial relationships affected the tenant families. And she was not willing to let social avoidance cost people who depended on the property's reputation. She had been to Hartwell's. She knew how these rooms worked. What she hadn't anticipated was Mrs. Aldgate's particular method of managing a table. She seated Ruth between two women whose husbands competed with Mercer's freight interests and opened the dinner conversation with the crystalline social cruelty of someone who has spent decades perfecting the technique. Mrs. Mercer, she said with the warm smile of a woman plunging a blade. What a remarkable story yours has been. We heard, of course, about your arrival at Blackthorn Hall. So dramatic. Your stepmother must be devastated by how things have turned out. The table went slightly quieter. Ruth set down her fork with the calm precision of a woman who has faced considerably more dangerous opponents than a dinner hostess. Mrs. Aldgate, she said pleasantly, Beatrice Ellison is a founding partner in a freight fraud company that operated in this valley for 5 years. Falsified a land trust established by my father and directed a conspiracy that ended in criminal arson charges against her associate. She signed a legal agreement restoring what she stole. Ruth picked her fork back up. I imagine she's managing her feelings about it. The estate accounts are considerably more interesting to me than her feelings. Complete silence. Then the woman to Ruth's left the wife of one of Mercer's freight competitors. a sharp-featured woman named Mrs. Dunbar who had said nothing since the soup made a sound that was categorically a laugh. Quickly controlled. "I've been wondering," Mrs. Dunbar said to Ruth, in the tonal shift of a woman who has just decided to stop being an opponent and start being curious. "Whether you're the person who found the RB Trading Incorporation record. My husband has been watching that case since the summer." "I am," Ruth said. "He said whoever found it had to have known exactly where to look." "I knew what a fraudulent freight entry looked like," Ruth said. The rest followed logically. Mrs. Dunbar looked at her for a moment. "He's been trying to get an honest accounts manager for 3 years. His current one is perfectly competent and thoroughly dull." "Do you take referral work?" "I do," Ruth said. "Then I'll send word next week." At the far end of the table, Mercer was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who is neither surprised nor particularly worried and is, in fact, quietly occupied by the business of being married to someone who handles a table the way she handles a ledger directly, without ornamentation, and with complete command of the relevant facts. Mrs. Aldgate, for her part, spent the rest of the dinner watching Ruth Ellison run her table for her and saying nothing, which was, under the circumstances, the wisest available option. In the carriage on the way home, Mercer said, "Mrs. Dunbar's husband runs 3 freight operations and 2 mill accounts." "I know," Ruth said. "I looked up his commercial filings in August." He turned his head to look at her. "In August, I was thorough," Ruth said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you've been building a client list." "I've been noticing opportunities," Ruth said. "There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved in the dark of the carriage. "Is there?" "Yes," Ruth said. "One is passive, the other is mine." He reached across and took her hand in the dark, and said nothing because nothing was necessary. The twist Ruth hadn't seen coming arrived on a Tuesday in November, in the form of a letter from William Cord. She was at her desk in the study when it arrived. Her desk, the one with her initials in the turned wood, the one that had been hers since the first week, and was simply acknowledged as such now. She opened it with the letter knife she kept in the top drawer and read it twice before she called for Mercer. He came in from the stable, she could tell, by the particular way he moved when his knee was cold. A slightly different weight distribution she'd catalogued without mentioning, because he didn't need to know he was being read quite that carefully. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up. "Rourke," he said. "Beatrice's brother," Ruth said. "The third partner in RB Trading. Cord says he's filed a counterclaim in the Pike criminal case, claiming that the entire scheme was Pike's construction and that he and Beatrice were misled investors. He's trying to separate himself from the arson charge." "Yes. And if his testimony is accepted, it reduces Beatrice's exposure as well." Ruth set the letter on the desk. "He's also claiming that the RB Trading Incorporation record was altered after the fact, and that Beatrice's name was added without her knowledge." Mercer said something short and specific under his breath that Ruth decided she hadn't heard. "They're not going to succeed," she said. "The incorporation filing has 3 independent witnesses and a commissioner's seal. But it means the hearing gets complicated. Cord wants me in Kingston at the end of the month to provide additional testimony about the 1811 survey record. Because Rourke is now claiming the survey commission was legitimate and my father's involvement was consensual." She paused. "He's using my father's own work to reconstruct the narrative." The room was very still. Mercer set the letter down. He looked at her with the full, direct attention that he reserved for things that mattered. "Can you break it?" he said. "Yes," Ruth said. "But I need the original survey commission document. My father's personal copy, the one that shows the buyer's agent notation as RB Trading before the company was formally incorporated." She paused. "Which means I need to prove that RB Trading was operating under that name in 1811. A year before the incorporation record they're now claiming was altered." "You have that document," Mercer said. "I have it," Ruth said. "I've had it since August. It was in my father's correspondence, in my traveling bag." She looked at him steadily. "The same bag I arrived here with." He understood immediately. "The document that proves the conspiracy predates the incorporation has been in this house since the day you walked in the door. Since before I knew what I was looking for," Ruth said. "My father kept copies of everything. Every commission, every contract, every buyer's agent notation. He built the evidence 30 years ago without knowing it was evidence." She looked at her father's letters on the corner of the desk, the packet she'd kept within arm's reach for 3 months. He trusted the numbers. He documented everything. He left me the tools to finish what he never got to start. Mercer was quiet for a moment that held more in it than either of them needed to say aloud. "Send Cord the document today," he said. "I already did," Ruth said. "I sent a certified copy this morning before I called you in." She met his eyes. "I wanted you to know, not to ask permission." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in the chair across from her desk, the chair that had always been his, the partner's position, and picked up his own work. "Rourke," he said without looking up, "is going to have a very unpleasant December." "January too," Ruth said, and turned back to her accounts. The Kingston hearing happened on the last Thursday of November. Ruth had been to 4 legal proceedings, by then the magistrate hearing for Pike, 2 certification sessions with the county recorder, and a deposition for the civil component of the trust recovery. She walked into the Kingston courthouse with Cord beside her, and her father's original survey commission in a leather portfolio and the complete accounting of every R.B. trading entry she'd found in Mercer's freight records. Rourke's attorney was better than Creswell had been. He was careful, well prepared, and he'd clearly anticipated the survey argument. He had a surveying expert who testified for 40 minutes about the range of dates on which a property commission of this type might have been initiated before formal paperwork was exchanged. Ruth sat and listened to every word. When it was her turn, she opened the leather portfolio. She produced the original commission document. She produced the buyer's agent notation with R.B. trading listed in her father's handwriting. She produced 3 additional survey commissions from 1,811 and 1,812, where her father had noted the same company name in correspondence before accepting work. Because Thomas Ellison had always verified the commercial identity of his clients before committing to a survey and had always kept the written record. Then she produced something Cord hadn't known she had. A letter from her father to his surveying partner, dated August 1811, describing the R.B. trading commission and noting a specific conversation he'd had with the buyer's agent, a conversation in which he'd been introduced to a man whose description matched precisely Daniel Pike. Her father had described the meeting in detail because he'd found Pike's manner slightly aggressive and had wanted to note it in case future dealings proved difficult. Thomas Ellison, a careful man, had left a written record of meeting his daughter's future enemy 8 years before that enemy completed the work against him. Rourke's attorney objected to the letter on hearsay grounds. The magistrate looked at the letter. He looked at its date. He looked at the described commission amount, which matched the R.B. trading entry in Mercer's freight log to the penny. He overruled the objection. Ruth did not allow herself any visible reaction. She set the letter on the table and waited. Rourke's case took 40 minutes to collapse. The counterclaim was dismissed. The original criminal charges against Pike were confirmed and expanded to include fraud in a second jurisdiction. Rourke's own involvement was referred for separate investigation. Beatrice, by extension, lost the only avenue that might have reduced her exposure. Cord shook Ruth's hand outside the courthouse. "The letter," he said. "When did you find it?" "I've had it since August," Ruth said. "I didn't know its relevance until I understood the full timeline. You've been carrying case-breaking evidence in your traveling bag for 3 months. My father taught me to keep everything," Ruth said. "He said you never know when a record becomes relevant." Cord looked at her. "He was a remarkable man." "Yes," Ruth said. "He was." She walked to the carriage where Mercer was waiting. He'd come for the hearing. positioned in the back of the room where she could find his face if she needed to. Present without crowding, supporting without replacing, and she climbed in and sat and held the leather portfolio in her lap. He didn't ask. "Clean column," he said quietly. She looked at him. She felt the weight of the day settle into something that was finished. Properly finished, the way a ledger closes when every entry is reconciled, and the final total is accurate, and there is nothing left to find. "Clean column," she said. He put his arm around her on the carriage seat, and she let herself lean into him, the way you lean into something solid when you've been holding your own weight for a very long time, and have finally, genuinely, earned the right to set it down. December came to Blackthorn Hall with the particular quality of cold that the Hudson Valley does differently than anywhere else, deep and clean, and carrying the smell of the river even far from the bank. The estate was changed from the house Ruth had walked into in August. Not dramatically, not in ways a stranger passing through would necessarily notice, but in the ways that mattered. The tenant families had received every dollar of their compensation. Mrs. Harmon's oldest surviving son had taken on part-time mill work that gave the family a winter income. The Garrett farm had repaired its north fence with the interest money. Amos had certified every payment and kept the receipts in the records room in a folder labeled. In his precise soldier's hand, accounts settled. The mill ran on the corrected account system Ruth had built. The freight logs were clean. The winter supply purchases went through a double-entry system she'd trained the new estate bookkeeper, a young woman named Clara. Amos's widowed niece, who had a precise mind and needed only the architecture of a proper system to demonstrate what she could do with it. Ruth had spent 3 weeks teaching Clara not just the method but the principle. Every figure represents a decision someone made. If you want to understand the figure, understand the decision. Clara understood. She was going to be excellent. Mercer had been seeing the physician from Hudson twice a month. His knee was not healed, it would not heal. That was simply the physical fact of it, but he was treating it instead of punishing himself for it. And the difference in his daily movement was real and visible. He no longer avoided the right staircase. He still favored his left side in wet weather, and she still quietly arranged to have the morning's work materials on the ground floor when rain was coming. And he still pretended not to notice, and they had both decided that this particular arrangement was satisfactory. He laughed more. Not publicly, not loudly. He was not a man built for public laughter, and she didn't want him to be. But in the evenings at the dining table, in the study when she read him something particularly absurd from the Albany Commerce reports. He laughed the way people laugh when they've stopped performing composure and are simply in a room with someone whose company requires no management. She had not known, until she lived inside it, what that felt like. The Albany dinner where she saw Beatrice happened on a Friday in December. It was a commercial gathering. Hartwell had invited both Mercer's freight interest and 2 other valley operations to discuss winter shipping schedules, and Beatrice's presence was coincidental. Connected to the host family through a social relationship that predated the summer's proceedings. Ruth saw her across the room before Beatrice saw her. Beatrice was thinner, more carefully dressed, in the way of someone managing appearances on reduced means. She was talking to the host's wife with the practiced social animation of a woman who has spent her life constructing the impression of ease. Then she turned and saw Ruth. Ruth watched the moment of recognition move through Beatrice's face, the brief, controlled arrest of expression, the rapid calculation, the decision about what to do with the next 30 seconds. Mercer beside Ruth felt her stillness and looked. He understood immediately. "Do you want to leave?" he said. "No," Ruth said. "I want to stand here." She watched Beatrice assess the room. Assess Ruth's position in it, the Hartwell connection. The Mercer name, the way 3 people had already crossed the room to speak with her since her arrival. Assess the complete social reality of what the summer had produced. Beatrice crossed the room. Ruth did not move toward her. She waited. Beatrice stopped in front of her, with the expression of a woman who has made a decision about dignity that cost her something considerable. "Ruth," she said. "Quiet, not performing, Beatrice," Ruth said. They looked at each other, across everything that had happened. 8 years of invisible labor. 20 years of a scheme built around a man who deserved better than any of it. A summer in a records room. A courthouse. A signed agreement. A silver thimble delivered by a daughter who'd finally chosen truth over orbit. Beatrice looked at her for a long moment. "You look well," she said finally. It was not a compliment deployed as a weapon. It was simply an observation from a woman who had expected something and was confronting something different. "I am well," Ruth said. Beatrice nodded once. She looked briefly at Mercer. He met her eyes with the flat steadiness of a man who has no performance left to offer her. She looked back at Ruth. "Lydia sends her regards," she said. "She's found a position, teaching arithmetic at a girls' school in Poughkeepsie." A pause. "She's good at it. Apparently she learned figures from watching you." Something moved in Ruth's chest. "Quiet and specific. Tell her I'm glad," Ruth said. Beatrice nodded again. She turned and walked back across the room. She did not look back. Ruth watched her go. She thought about cruelty and the shape it takes when it runs out of leverage. She thought about her father's thimble in her jewelry box at Blackthorn Hall, and Lydia standing up in a parlor and saying "I can't" with her mother watching. She thought about numbers and what they said when no one was lying. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more permanent than triumph. She felt finished. Mercer touched her arm lightly. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked back into the room. On the last evening of December, Ruth sat at her desk in the study at Blackthorn Hall. The estate journal was open to the final pages of the year, 12 months of entries. The first half in Daniel Pike's falsified hand, the last 4 months in Ruth's clean and unambiguous accounting. She was writing the year-end summary, the kind her father had taught her to produce. Every significant transaction, every corrected entry, every account closed and balanced, clean columns. The fire was burning. The dog was on the hearthrug in the particular boneless arrangement of a creature who has decided that comfort is a permanent condition and intends to enjoy it thoroughly. Mercer was in his chair across the room, the partner's chair, reading the Hudson Valley Gazette with the focused attention he gave everything, and the occasional quiet commentary on commerce news that she had come to rely on as a reliable indication of his actual opinions. "The Rourke indictment is in the paper," he said. "Third page. They've expanded the charges." "I know," Ruth said without looking up. "Cord sent word yesterday. It mentions RB trading by name. Gives the founding date as 1812. It should read 1811, Ruth said. But the 1812 date is what the incorporated record shows, and that's what the paper has. The 1811 documentation is in the court file." She turned a page. "Historians can sort it out." He made the sound that was his version of amusement. She'd cataloged that sound thoroughly over 4 months. It was becoming one of her favorite sounds. She finished the final entry. She wrote the year-end total. She checked it against the running balance twice. Not because she doubted herself, but because her father had always checked twice, and she intended to maintain the standard. The total was accurate. Every account reconciled. Every entry sourced. Blackthorn Hall's first complete clean year of accounts in 6 years. Closing on New Year's Eve, with every fraudulent entry corrected, and every tenant family compensated, and every document bearing Ruth Mercer's signature in a courthouse record somewhere that required a judge to officially ignore it if anyone ever wanted to make it disappear. She closed the ledger. Mercer looked up from his paper. He looked at her closed ledger, her folded hands, her face. "Done," she said. He set the paper down. "Do you remember arriving here in August?" Ruth looked at the fire. She thought about the coach, the August heat, the forged letter pressed against her palm. The gate. the walk up the drive with her bag in her hand, and Beatrice's cruelty at her back and 73 cents in her glove. She thought about a chair pulled toward a cold hearth by a man who refused to complete another person's cruelty. I remember believing, she said, that the worst person in the story had already decided its ending. He was quiet for a moment. What changed? Ruth looked at her father's letters on the corner of the desk. She looked at the ledger under her hands, full of her own work, bearing her own name. She looked at the chair she was sitting in, with her initials in the wood, permanent and specific and belonging to no one but her. She looked at the man across the room who had read a forged letter and offered her a chair, and then, at every subsequent moment when he could have taken her choices away, had refused to do it. Someone gave me a chair, she said. And then he had the good sense to let me decide whether I would remain in it. Mercer looked at her from across the fire with the open, unguarded expression of a man who has stopped managing the distance between himself and the people who matter to him. And did you, he said, decide? Ruth looked around the study at the clean ledger, the corrected accounts, the chair with her initials, the dog, the man who had given her not rescue but room. Not charity but choice, not a story in which she was saved but one in which she was finally, irrevocably known. Every single day, she said, and I intend to keep deciding for a considerable time. Mercer crossed the room. He sat on the edge of her desk the way he'd been sits in the edge of things all fall close. Without crowding, present, without consuming. He looked at her with everything he'd stopped holding back. Good, he said. Ruth opened the new ledger. The first page of a new year. Blank and accurate and ready. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date. She began. She had arrived at Blackthorn Hall with nothing but her father's training, her own clear eyes, and the capacity to read what numbers actually said, and she had built from those three things a life that no forged letter, no corrupt scheme, and no cruel woman's careful plan could touch, because it was documented and witnessed and permanent, and because it was entirely, completely, and forever her own.